Tonight, I want to tell you a story that might change how you think about one of history's darkest moments. What would have happened if, during the Clone Wars' final hours, the machinery of genocide had caught a single flaw and broken apart in the hands of those meant to execute it? It is a story about choice, about the split second before an order becomes an action, about what happens when beings designed never to have free will suddenly, unexpectedly do. The Clone Wars ended on a single day, 22 BBY by the official calendar. But it did not end with a bang or a rallying cry or a last stand of heroes. It ended with hesitation. It ended with refusal. And because of that refusal, everything that came after became possible. So let me take you back to Utapau, to the moment when the whole design, the one that had been carefully constructed across 1,000 worlds, shattered like glass. Utapau is not a planet you would choose to visit unless you had a specific reason. It is a world of sinkholes, enormous pits carved deep into stone over millions of years, each one a canyon within the earth, ringed by stone and housing entire cities carved into the walls themselves. The sunlight down there is thin and angled. There is always a sense of being watched by cliffs. Pau City sits in one of the largest sinkholes of all, and by the time our story reaches it, the separatist military had made the city their stronghold. General Obi-Wan Kenobi was sent to Utapau to end that occupation. He was sent to find and kill General Grievous, the supreme commander of the separatist droid army, a being who had eluded the Republic for years and left a trail of dead Jedi behind him. Obi-Wan was not alone. With him were the soldiers of the 212th Attack Battalion, part of the 7th Sky Corps, an entire force of clone troopers bearing the orange and white markings of their unit on their armor. They had served with Obi-Wan through years of the Clone Wars, the frozen fields of Christophsis, the dust storms of Ryloth, the grinding campaigns in the Outer Rim. They knew him, and he knew them. The man who commanded them was designated CC-2224, though he had given himself the name Cody. Clone troopers were permitted to adopt names, to take ownership of themselves in that small way, and Cody had been one of the finest commanders in the Grand Army of the Republic. He was competent, loyal, thoughtful, and he had developed something close to real affection for his general over years of fighting beside him. The operation on Utapau was successful. Obi-Wan hunted Grievous through the twisting architecture of Pau City, faced him in personal combat, and killed him, something no one else had managed to do. As Grievous lay dying, Obi-Wan took a blaster from the ground and shot him, a detail that stands out because Obi-Wan disliked blasters, called them uncivilized, preferred his lightsaber. But sometimes necessity overrides preference. The battle was over. Grievous was dead. The separatist command structure on Utapau was broken. It was at this moment, with the victory still settling like dust in the air, that Commander Cody received a message. A hologram resolved into being, transmitted simultaneously to clone commanders across the entire galaxy. It was from the office of the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, Palpatine himself. What Cody received was Order 66, not a suggestion, not a request, not even technically an order in the ordinary sense of the word. It was Contingency Order 66, one of 150 standing orders embedded in the clone army's communication protocols, designed for a specific scenario. If Jedi officers ever acted against the interests of the Republic, the clones were to eliminate them immediately. What makes this moment worth lingering on is not what happened next, but what was happening underneath it. Inside every clone trooper's brain, built into their genetic code itself during their creation on Kamino years earlier, was a biochip. A small organic machine, invisible to every scan and every examination, woven into the neural tissue itself. It had been implanted there as a failsafe, a guarantee that clones could never truly rebel, could never refuse an order from their superiors, could never follow their own will over the will of the state. These chips had been designed by the Kaminoans, but not for the Kaminoans. They served a master they did not know they were serving. Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who had orchestrated the entire Clone Wars as a mechanism to destroy the Jedi Order from within, had designed these chips years ago. He had hidden them inside the army he had commissioned, a trap that would spring the moment he gave the word. Order 66 was that word. When the transmission reached Commander Cody, it carried a verification code that identified it as coming directly from the Supreme Chancellor. The biochip in Cody's neural tissue received the order and should have activated. The suppression should have taken hold. His free will should have been overridden. His sense of right and wrong should have been switched off like a light, and he should have turned to his general with no memory of choosing to do so and no emotional resistance to what he was about to do. But that is not what happened, or rather, it did not happen the way it was designed to happen. Because in the moment between the order arriving and the order being executed, in that fraction of a second where command should have become action, something went wrong. Not just with Cody, but across multiple squadrons of the 212th. The biochip's activation sequence faltered. The suppression never took full hold. Something in the machinery broke. Cody found himself staring at his general, at Obi-Wan, who had just handed him his lightsaber back, which Cody had recovered for him after it fell during the battle with Grievous. They looked at each other. Obi-Wan did not know what was about to happen. Cody did know, but he could feel the difference between knowing what he was supposed to do and actually wanting to do it. And in that moment, Commander Cody, CC 2224, one of the finest soldiers the clone army had produced, made a choice that he was never supposed to be able to make. He hesitated. It was not much. It was just long enough to turn to the ATTE Walker gunner behind him to order the shot to miss. It was long enough to tell the other clone troopers not to follow up. It was long enough to help his general escape, to give him a moment of warning, to let him live. That hesitation, that tiny fraction of a second where free will flickered back to life, changed everything. Across the galaxy, other biochips were experiencing the same malfunction. In other battalions on other worlds, clones were suddenly waking up to what they had been about to do and finding they could choose not to do it. The machinery was breaking down. The trap was failing. The design that had been intended to be perfect was showing its first catastrophic flaw. What happened next would ripple outward like a stone dropped into still water, reaching across the galaxy, touching every faction, every planet, every person with power enough to matter. It would begin to unravel everything Palpatine had so carefully constructed. But at the precise moment it began, on the cliffs of Utapau, it was just a man choosing not to kill another man. Just a soldier choosing his own conscience over the command he was supposed to blindly obey. Just a moment of refusal where submission was supposed to be absolute and eternal. Sometimes that is all it takes. Sometimes the weight of everything that comes after rests on something that small. Let me tell you how that weight fell. On the planet Caller, in the humid green hills where the Separatists had dug their final stronghold, Clone Force 99 was finishing what should have been a routine mission when the signal came through. A transmission from the Chancellor himself, routed through military encryption, carried in the voice of Palpatine like an order that could never be questioned. For most of the clone army across the galaxy, that signal reached deep into the brainstem and took hold, overriding thought, overriding loyalty, overriding the bonds forged in 10,000 shared battles. But Clone Force 99 were not most of the clone army. Their genetic mutations, the rare, unpredictable variations coded into their DNA by Kaminoan designers who were trying to create something better, something more capable, meant that the inhibitor chips implanted in their skulls were always going to behave differently, always going to struggle for absolute control in ways the standard template could never resist. Crosshair felt it first, the activation sliding through his nervous system like cold water through a clear stream, and for a moment his free will simply stopped, like a hand closing around his mind. His enhanced eyes, sharper than any sniper in the Republic, locked onto Caleb Dume, the Padawan, the boy, the someday Jedi they had fought alongside for months, and his finger moved toward the trigger with a certainty that did not belong to him. But Sergeant Hunter, who whose senses were honed to detect the presence of enemies and the temperature of air and the chemical signatures of fear, noticed. And in the fraction of a second that Crosshair's chip had purchased for itself, Hunter made a choice that the protocol had not anticipated. He did not fire on the boy either. He let him go. Wrecker, whose strength was legendary among the Bad Batch, whose enthusiasm for a fight was childlike and uncomplicated and beautiful in its directness, simply did not move to comply. Whatever the chip was trying to do in the depth of his skull, it could not override the simpler fact that he did not want to. Tech, whose mind processed information at speeds that should not have been biologically possible, was still analyzing what was happening even as the order was being executed by someone else's hands across 1,000 planets. And Echo, who had been tortured and remade by the Techno Union on Scarco Minor, who had been partially converted into a machine in order to survive, who carried cybernetic enhancements that sometimes felt like foreign things grafted onto what he had once been, found that the chip in his brain could not fully bind itself to circuitry that was not flesh. What happened in that moment on Caller was a small miracle of failure, a mechanical breakdown at precisely the moment when the entire architecture of genocide depended on absolute compliance. But it was also the beginning of a terrible understanding. Because the inhibitor chips did not fail cleanly, and the clones who resisted them did not come away unscathed. As the order dissolved, and Caleb Dume ran, and the sound of gunfire faded in the humid air, the members of Clone Force 99 were left standing in the wreckage of what they had almost done, fully conscious now, fully aware of exactly what had been intended. There was no medication for that awareness. There was no program that could be rewritten to make it clean again. I find myself thinking about the moment when a being suddenly understands that its own body had been prepared to betray its own morality, that there had been something planted in its meat like a seed that was always going to grow into killing when the right signal reached it. There is a particular kind of horror in that, not violence witnessed, not violence inflicted by your own hands, but violence nearly inflicted by your own hands against your will, and the understanding that you almost could not have stopped it. Across the galaxy, in other moments that were happening simultaneously, other clones were having very similar reckoning with the same terrible truth. On Mandalore during the siege, Clone Captain Rex felt the signal and recognized it immediately because a friend had warned him, had died trying to warn him. Clone Trooper 5's CT-275555, an ARC trooper who had discovered the chips and paid for that discovery with his life. Rex had his chip removed by Ahsoka Tano, using nothing but the Force and the skill of hands that had learned to heal rather than harm. And so when the order came, he was able to choose, to turn his gun away from the woman he had fought beside for years, to help her live even as the clone troopers around them on the Venator were turning on their Jedi commanders with the precision of mathematics. But choice itself was a wound. On Felucia, Clone Commander Bly felt the order take hold and he executed it, firing on General Arilla Secura from behind. And in the moment after she fell, the chip released him, and he was left understanding exactly what his hands had done and why they had done it, and that he could not have stopped them. The chip failures on Caller and above Mandalore and across the scattered worlds where Clone and Jedi still fought together created a singular kind of rupture in the Empire's plans. Palpatine had constructed the entire mechanism so that clones would not even know they had been compromised, so that they would believe their own actions were their own judgments. But now, in the moment of partial failure, they could feel the seams of the trap, could understand the architecture of their own violation, and that understanding could not be unlearned. Hunter and his squad were not alone in experiencing this clarity. Commander Cody, one of the most loyal and decorated clone officers in the entire Republic, had felt Order 66 activate without the same resistance, and on Utapau he had ordered fire on Obi-Wan Kenobi. But somewhere in the tumultuous hours after, as the galaxy began to reorganize itself around a new government, the simple fact of that obedience began to trouble him in ways that would grow deeper with every passing day. The question that Clone Force 99 began to grapple with in those first hours on Korla was the question that would define the next year of the galaxy's history. If you nearly commit genocide, if your own body prepares itself to kill the people you love at a command you cannot resist, what does it mean to be you anymore? What loyalty means when loyalty can be overridden by programming? What choice means when choice can be drowned out by chips in the brainstem? What it means to be a soldier, a person, a being with agency, when that agency has been systematically undermined by the very government that taught you how to fight. On Korla, the Bad Batch began to understand that their genetic anomalies, their mutations, the very things that had always set them apart from the standard clones, had given them a strange gift. Their own resistance was not perfect, but it was real, and the question of what they would do with that resistance, how they would live with it, was only beginning to unfold. In the first hours after Order 66, something very strange began to happen across the galaxy, in communications channels that no one at the Imperial Palace in Coruscant was watching closely enough. The inhibitor chips were failing, not in the neat, systematic way a machine fails, but in the way a fundamental assumption fails when reality decides not to cooperate. You have to understand that these chips had never malfunctioned before, not on any scale that mattered. They were engineered on Kamino by the Kaminoans themselves, understood in their smallest details by Chief Medical Scientist Nala C and Prime Minister Lama Su, built into clone embryos at the cellular level, a certainty as foundational as the clone's own accelerated growth. And then, without warning or explanation, they began to break. On Mandalore, Captain Rex of the 332nd Company stood in the silence after what should have been his own murder, should have been him, acting against his will, cutting down Ahsoka Tano, the Togruta officer whose markings his brothers had painted on their own helmets out of simple affection and respect. He didn't move for a moment, just breathing in the recycled air of his helmet, aware of the weight of the weapon in his hands and the magnitude of what had just not happened. And then he did something quiet and deliberate. He switched to the encrypted ARC Trooper frequency, a channel he had access to by rank and training, and he transmitted a simple message to every ARC Trooper he could reach across the clone army's communications network. The message was sparse, no longer than a combat sitrep, and it carried a weight that no formal order could match. The chips, the message said, had failed. Order 66 was a betrayal. Resist. Across the holonet, moving through the quantum-encrypted relays that threaded between star destroyers and forward operating bases and command stations on 1,000 different worlds, that message began to propagate. An ARC trooper on a frigate orbiting Felucia received it and understood immediately what it meant. It meant Commander Bly's execution of General Arela Secura had been a choice, not an inevitability, and that knowledge was a kind of wound. Another received it on a transport moving away from Maijito, where Ki-Adi-Mundi had fallen to clone fire, and the question that formed in that trooper's mind was terrible and would not leave him. What if it had been possible not to do that? The messages spread not like wildfire, because they moved through encrypted channels in the deliberate architecture of military communications, but like something quieter and more difficult to stop, like a thought that, once it enters a consciousness, cannot be cleanly removed. On the 212th Attack Battalion's flagship orbiting Utapau, Commander Cody sat in the communications center and stared at the readout from his own vital signs monitor, at the fading echo of the compulsion that had nearly made him execute Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he understood with stark clarity that what Rex was transmitting was true. He made a choice then, one that would reshape his life and bind him to a path of resistance. He began to reach out, quietly, to clone officers he knew and trusted, using subaudible frequencies and deliberately fragmented transmissions that would be nearly impossible for automated scanners to assemble into meaningful intelligence. Commander Cody, who had fought alongside General Kenobi for 3 years of war, who had trusted him and been trusted in return, now passed a simple fact through the clone ranks. The general had been spared. Order 66 had failed, at least in one place, at least for one man. In the hidden valley on Korla, where Clone Commander Grey had made the choice to end his own life rather than complete the execution of Padawan Caleb Dume, other members of the 104th Battalion began to understand what had occurred. That one of their brothers had somehow broken the conditioning, that the chip's power had limits, that one could push back against programming if the moment was right, and the choice was clear enough. Clone Commander Gregor, stationed on a ship moving through the Outer Rim, received transmissions fragmentary and encrypted, and he made a decision that would echo through the next 10 years of his life. He chose to disappear, to remove himself from the Imperial structure, and ensure that he could not be forced to hunt Jedi or brothers who had resisted. The communications became denser as the hours passed, not a unified network, but a constellation of isolated transmissions, each one careful, each one carrying the same essential message in different formulations. The chips had broken. Some clones had resisted. The order was not absolute. Captain Rex, aboard the Venator-class Star Destroyer carrying the 332nd Company, made a second choice. He and Ahsoka jettisoned the ship's Y-wing complement and initiated a crash descent toward the icy moon below, knowing that the waters of impact would be cold enough to kill, and knowing that his absence would be interpreted as death. A choice that would give him the only thing a resisting clone could truly have, which was time and the possibility of obscurity. In the encrypted channels, other voices began to emerge, not organized, not coordinated beyond what individual consciousness and access to military frequencies could accomplish, but real. Clone officers asking simple questions of one another, questions that the chips had been designed to prevent them from asking. Where is General Junda? Has anyone reached the 501st? Are there Jedi who survived? Commander Wolf of the 104th Battalion received some of these messages and felt something in himself rupture. The chip's hold was weakening, or perhaps had never been as complete in him as it was meant to be, and he found himself imagining possibilities that the Order had been designed to foreclose. On Kamino itself, in the vast cloning facilities where Omega, the unmodified female clone, walked through corridors that were beginning to fill with Imperial officers and restructuring directives, clone troopers who had been assigned to internal security began to move with a subtle hesitancy, aware through the same encrypted channels that something fundamental had changed, that the absolute machinery of their obedience had revealed itself to be made of parts that could fail. In the first 12 hours after Order 66 was issued, the communications network of the clone army became something other than a tool of unified command. It became a space where doubt could travel, where questions could propagate, where the architecture of the conspiracy could be glimpsed by those with the clearance and the courage to look. It was not yet resistance, not in any organized sense. It was something quieter and more provisional. It was the beginning of understanding that the chips had been a choice made somewhere by someone, and that understanding alone could not be erased or overwritten by new orders. And as those 12 hours stretched toward their close, clone troopers across 1,000 worlds went about their duties in a new kind of silence, aware now of the weight in their own skulls, the presence of the thing that had nearly annihilated their will, and the startling knowledge that it could fail. In the hours after Cody's hesitation on Utapau, Obi-Wan Kenobi found himself alive in a way that should have been impossible, clinging to the cold stone of a sinkhole pool while clone fire echoed somewhere above him in the thin air. He had a moment, alone in that darkness, to feel the weight of what had almost happened, the familiar weight of his clone commander's hand, now not reaching to strike him down, but to pull him back from the edge. When he climbed out, soaked and shaking with something that was not quite cold, Cody was waiting with a face that looked like a man who had just woken from a dream he could not quite forget. The commander said nothing, only offered his arm, and in that small gesture Obi-Wan understood that something fundamental in the architecture of the Empire had fractured before it could fully take hold. What Cody told him came in fragments: the biochip, The order, the moment of refusal that should never have been possible, spreading now through encrypted channels like a light that could not be extinguished. Obi-Wan listened the way a general listens to intelligence reports. Methodically, analytically, his mind already moving across the galaxy to calculate the scope of what this rupture might mean. He had been trained by Qui-Gon Jinn to see the larger shape of things, to think not of the moment, but of the weight it carried forward in time. And he did that now, quietly, while Cody spoke of Rex and the message spreading through ARC trooper channels. By the time they reached a commandeered Imperial shuttle, Obi-Wan had begun to understand that he was not alone, that across the galaxy, in that same fraction of a second, other clones had made the same impossible choice. I think there is something worth pausing on here, something about the nature of what was happening in those hours. The inhibitor chips had not simply failed in a way that left the clones free and equal to their Jedi commanders. The failure had a particular shape. It did not erase the programming, it made it visible. Each clone who broke free of Order 66 did so while feeling, for perhaps the first time in their lives, the exact architecture of their own violation. They could sense the pathways the chip had carved into their will, the way it had nested itself into their thinking, the careful geometry of their own captivity. When they chose to refuse, they were not choosing into blankness or freedom. They were choosing into the full, terrible knowledge of what had been done to them. That distinction matters, I think, because it shaped what came next in ways that would not become clear for some time. Obi-Wan made his way to the spaceport with a small escort of loyal troops, his mind moving through the problem like a hand tracing the shape of a broken mechanism. The first order of business was communication, and the second was survival, and the third was to understand how many others had made it. He thought of Yoda, alone on Kashyyyk with Commander Gree and the Wookiee warriors, and hoped with the quiet intensity of a prayer that the Grand Master's training had been as complete as his own. He thought of Ki-Adi-Mundi on Mygeeto, of Arila Secura on Felucia, of Plo Koon in the crystalline skies above Cato Nemoidia, thought of them the way a man thinks of doors closing one by one in the dark. He did not know yet that most of those doors had indeed closed, that most of those orders had succeeded, that the massacre had been nearly total. What he knew was that Cody was alive, that the message had spread, that something in the clone army had awakened to its own will and refused to sleep again. When he reached the spaceport, the ship that was waiting had been arranged by contacts deeper than any hierarchy the Empire could immediately reach. Senator Bail Organa's people, moving already in those first hours with the careful precision of people who understood that history was being made in real time and required saving. Bail had been in the Senate chamber when Palpatine declared himself, had heard the thunder of applause that should never have been, and had understood in that moment that the Jedi were marked for extinction. He was already reaching out to surviving Jedi with the careful discretion of a politician who had learned very young that some truths could not be spoken aloud. The journey to the Tantive IV felt long in a way that had nothing to do with time. Obi-Wan sat in the darkened cabin of a courier vessel, thinking through what he knew and what he did not know, which was almost everything. He knew that Anakin had turned, that the temple had been breached, that the systematic architecture of the Jedi's destruction was already moving across the galaxy with imperial efficiency. What he did not know was whether Yoda still lived, whether any of the Council had survived, whether there was anyone left to save, or only ghosts to count. When the Tantive IV emerged from hyperspace, Obi-Wan climbed aboard with the bearing of a man who was still, despite everything, a Jedi Master, still upright, still methodical, still thinking toward the future rather than drowning in the weight of the present. Bail was waiting, and with him came the first real confirmation. Scattered reports, encrypted messages, the slow assembly of a pattern. Yoda lived. The Grand Master had survived Kashyyyk, had faced Gree's blaster fire and answered it with a lightsaber's swift mercy. and was now moving through the darkness of the galaxy with the same careful intention Obi-Wan himself embodied. Beyond that, the picture fractured into uncertainty and loss. Ki-Adi-Mundi was gone, executed on Maijito by his own troops under the chip's control before the malfunction even reached them. Arila Secura had fallen on Felucia, shot down by Commander Bly and his forces, one of the first shown Order 66 successes, which meant the timing had been brutally efficient. Plo Koon's starfighter had been shot down over Kato Nemoidia by clone wingmen who had no malfunction to save them, only obedience. The losses came in like waves, and with each one, Obi-Wan felt not a breaking but a settling, a terrible crystallization of what the Empire intended and how ruthlessly it had been engineered. But Yoda lived, and Obi-Wan lived, and across the galaxy, in ways that were only beginning to become clear, other Jedi had found themselves spared by the same impossible flicker of clone will that had saved him on Utapau. A Padawan named Caleb Dume had been warned by Hunter of Clone Force 99 and had run, young, untrained fully, but alive, carrying forward a light that did not know yet it would eventually become known as Kanan Jarrus. Others moved through the darkness in ones and twos, finding their way to the Outer Rim, to planets where the Empire's reach had not yet solidified, to the spaces between stars where a Jedi could still breathe. As Obi-Wan stood in the communications center of the Tantive IV, learning to reverse the Temple's beacon so that it would warn rather than call, he understood that the Jedi Order's destruction was real and nearly complete, but that its ending was not quite final. The clones had given them time, in those few hours of hesitation and refusal, and time was a gift that could not be unmade. There is a particular kind of gravity that settles over a moment when you understand you are not the last. It is not hope, exactly, though hope lives in it. It is something quieter, the knowledge that you carry forward not only yourself, but the possibility that others carry, that survival is not individual, but woven into a larger shape you cannot yet see. Obi-Wan felt that weight settle into him like a stone sinking through deep water, and he turned toward the work that lay ahead with the steady breath of a man who had learned long ago that the future would be made by those who kept moving when everything told them to stop. Across the galaxy, in the hours after Order 66 spreads across the holonet, clone commanders begin to understand something that changes everything. They are not alone in their defection, and their refusal has already begun to resonate outward into the military structure itself. On a Venator-class star destroyer hanging above the Outer Rim world of Salukami, a clone naval officer sits at a communications station and reads Captain Rex's encrypted message a second time, then a third, each time feeling the weight of it settle deeper into his chest. The message is simple. The chips have failed, the order is a betrayal, and there are others, many others, who will not comply. Around him, the bridge crew continues its rotation, as if nothing has changed, as if the entire foundation of command has not just cracked open. But something has cracked, and everyone on that bridge is beginning to sense it in the way their hands move differently over the controls, in the hesitation before they execute orders, in the small, terrible knowledge that resistance is not only possible, but is already happening. 3 systems away, Admiral Wolf Yularen stands in the command center of his own flagship, a massive Venator-class vessel that has spent the last months hunting separatist remnants across the Outer Rim, and he is making a choice that only becomes clear to him as he makes it. Yularen is a career officer of the Republic Navy, a man who has served with distinction and has built his entire adult life on the premise that the Republic, however imperfect, deserves his loyalty. He has received the Chancellor's declaration simultaneously with the encrypted reports of clone commanders across the theater expressing doubt, confusion, and in some cases explicit refusal to accept the order. The declaration itself troubles him. It came too quickly, too cleanly, as if it had been prepared in advance and was merely waiting for an excuse to be issued. And the pieces, when he arranges them in his mind, do not fit together in any configuration that suggests anything but conspiracy. He considers this for perhaps 30 seconds, standing very still in the center of his bridge while his crew works around him, and then he makes the transmission. "All Republic vessels in Sector 7, this is Admiral Yularen," he says, and his voice is level and formal, as if he is simply executing routine orders. "We are to discontinue current heading toward Coruscant and hold position pending clarification of HoloNet broadcasts. Repeat, hold position and await clarification." It is not a refusal, technically. It is a delay, a request for verification, the kind of procedural caution that is entirely within an admiral's authority to invoke. But every officer on that bridge understands what it means. The Star Destroyer is not going to Coruscant. It is going to stay here, in the black space between stars, and wait to see what happens next. And Yularen, in making this choice, has just become something he never expected to be, a conspirator against the Chancellor's orders. Across the void, on Mon Cala, a Mon Calamari fleet captain named Jael Akbar, not yet an admiral, not yet the legendary commander he will become, but already possessed of a clarity of mind that marks him as exceptional, receives the same declaration and the same encrypted warnings from clone naval officers he has come to know over the campaigns of the war. Mon Cala is not formally part of the Republic Navy, though the Mon Calamari have fought alongside Republic forces in their defense against separatist occupation and Quarren uprising. But Akbar has stood in the same command centers as clone officers, has listened to their briefings, has seen the bonds they form with their Jedi commanders. And he understands, with the particular clarity that comes to a being who lives in the water and thus learns early to read the currents beneath the surface, that something genuinely monstrous has just been attempted. He makes a choice that commits his people. The Mon Calamari fleet will not answer calls to assemble under Imperial authority. Instead, it will remain in its home waters, available to any Jedi or Republic officers who might need shelter. It is a small gesture of defiance, but Mon Calamari are builders, not warriors by nature, and the gesture costs something. On Coruscant itself, in the shadow of the Jedi Temple still burning from the 501st Legion's assault, a clone commander of the Coruscant Guard sits in a detention facility and understands that he has made a choice he cannot undo. Commander Fox had his orders, had his chain of command, had every structural reason to comply with what the Chancellor commanded. But he had also, over the years of the war, come to understand that the Jedi were not the enemies the Chancellor now claims them to be. And somewhere in the gap between orders and conscience, he chose conscience. It cost him his freedom, his rank, his place in the army he had served since consciousness itself. But he is still himself, still capable of choice, and that knowledge is both his punishment and his solace. From station to station, from fleet to fleet, from isolated commanders in the darkness between worlds, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a unified rebellion, not yet, but a network of refusals. Some are explicit and costly, like Fox's choice on Coruscant. Some are procedural and technical, like Yularen's request for clarification. Some are quietly geographic, like Akbar's commitment to harbor anyone who seeks shelter. What they share is a single understanding. The galaxy is not broken beyond the possibility of repair, because people, clones and officers, and Mon Calamari captains and men of principle, are choosing moment by moment to refuse complicity. And complicity refused is the beginning of something else entirely. There is something I find myself thinking about in the quiet hours when you contemplate what could have been. If Admiral Yularen had simply complied, if Fox had simply obeyed, if Akbar had simply turned away, then the machinery of the Empire would have locked into place with barely a tremor. The Jedi would have fallen, silently and completely, and Palpatine's vision of galactic order would have crystallized into permanence. But they did not comply. They chose delay, hesitation, shelter. They chose to turn the machines of war in directions they had not been intended to go, to use the channels of command to ask questions instead of issue certainties. And in doing so, they bent the arc of history just slightly toward a different future. It is a small thing, perhaps, but galaxies turn on small things, on the moment when someone chooses to hesitate instead of act, to question instead of obey. The full consequences of these choices will take weeks to unfold, and some will not become apparent until much later. But on this day, in the scattered fleets hanging in the dark, a new architecture of resistance is taking shape, piece by piece, ship by ship, one choice at a time. 2 days after the clone mutiny spreads across the stars, Yoda finds himself in a narrow corridor of Polis Massa, a place built into the bones of an asteroid, where every shadow carries the weight of recent loss. He has felt it through the Force like a wound that will not close. The moment Order 66 rippled outward, and thousands of Jedi sensations simply ceased, leaving only absence and silence in the channels of the Force where living minds had been. On Kashyyyk, when Commander Gree's blaster rose toward him, the Grand Master had sensed in that fraction of a second what was happening across the entire galaxy. A betrayal written into the very biology of those who had stood beside the Jedi for 3 years of war. But Gree's chip failed just as so many others failed, and Yoda had moved with a speed that belied his 9 centuries. A small green shape impossibly fast, impossibly certain. And Tarful and Chewbacca had guided him to a ship with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a debt honored between old allies. Now, standing in Polis Massa's medical station, watching Obi-Wan move between rooms where surviving Jedi rest in medical suspension or recover from wounds both physical and spiritual, Yoda speaks very quietly. The Jedi Order has fallen, he says, and the words seem too simple for the enormity of what they mean. Yoda had walked those temple corridors for nearly 900 years, had trained masters, had counseled the Republic, had believed, perhaps too deeply, that the Jedi's presence in the galaxy was woven into its very fabric. Now most of them are gone, and the temple itself has been desecrated by clone battalions under the command of Anakin Skywalker, and the dark side hangs over Coruscant like a storm that will not lift. But the clones have refused, Obi-Wan says, and there is something almost fragile in his voice, as if he is trying to hold onto this single fact as a kind of anchor. And Yoda, for the first time since Kashyyyk, allows something that might be called hope to settle into his expression, though it is a hope tempered by terrible experience and much deeper now than simple optimism. Yes, he says, and I find myself thinking about what that means, that in the machinery of genocide, in the biochips designed by Palpatine's will and buried in clone tissue on Kamino, something has broken that was meant to be unbreakable. The inhibitor chips were designed to suppress free will absolutely, to make clone troopers into instruments without doubt or hesitation, and yet across the galaxy, in scattered units and isolated battalions, that suppression has fractured. Captain Rex has sent encrypted messages that move through clone channels like a question asked in whispers. Who are we, if we are not the tool we were made to be? Commander Cody on Utapau, the 41st Elite Corps on Kashyyyk, where Gree and his brother Trooper died rather than kill Yoda. These are not isolated incidents, but a pattern, a flaw in the master design that runs deeper than Palpatine anticipated. Yoda understands something now that shames him a little. The Jedi had relied on the clone army as an instrument, had trusted in their loyalty as if it were a force of nature, and had never truly seen the clones as anything but extensions of the Order's will. Now the clones are seeing themselves, seeing the chains they had been made to wear, and in that terrible seeing, some of them are choosing defiance. We must gather the survivors, Yoda tells those assembled in the station. Ki-Adi-Mundi is lost, Stas Ali is lost, Plo Koon and so many others. But Obi-Wan brings word of young Caleb Dune, a Padawan who escaped on Korla when his master Depa Billaba gave her life so he could run, when Clone Commander Grey performed an act of such profound moral rupture that he sacrificed himself to stop Imperial pursuit, to honor the one thing his better self remembered. Across the galaxy, in hidden places, other Jedi survive. Ahsoka Tano, who was never quite a Jedi by the end, who staged her death and vanished with Captain Rex into hiding. Seer Junda in her monastery, Eno Cordova in the archives, Cal Kestis, young and traumatized, carrying the weight of what he has witnessed. The number is not large. A handful of masters at most, scattered Padawans, survivors who are terrified and alone and desperately aware that the temple beacon is still calling, even now, still broadcasting a signal meant to gather the survivors only so they can be slaughtered in one final, efficient act. So the first thing Yoda and Obi-Wan had done, before anything else, was return to the temple itself. A choice of extraordinary danger, moving through the desecrated halls where younglings had been executed, where the Jedi's greatest library and deepest secrets lay exposed or burning, where the very stones seemed to ache with betrayal. They had gone to the beacon chamber, to that ancient machinery that was meant to guide Jedi home, and they had reversed its signal. Not a call to return, but a warning. Do not come, the signal now whispers into the Force for those with ears to hear it. Go into hiding, trust no one, the temple is a trap. It is an act of heartbreak and necessity combined, and when Yoda speaks of it now, his eyes are very old and very sad. But there is work ahead, he says to those gathering, to Bail Organa who stands with them now as one of the few non-Jedi who has chosen to aid them, to the scattered officers and survivors who are beginning to understand that this is not a temporary emergency, but the beginning of a very long war. The clone army is fracturing, Yoda explains, and he reaches out through the Force as he speaks, sensing the network of doubt and resistance spreading through military channels. Rex's encrypted messages, Cody's careful silence on Utapau, Wolf and Gregor, and others beginning to understand that they can choose, that their bodies and minds are their own. We must use this, Yoda says, and there is something in his voice now that speaks to the pragmatism beneath the spiritual wisdom. 900 years of living have taught the Grand Master that mercy and strategy are not opposites, but often the same thing viewed from different angles. The clones know the Empire's movements. They control star destroyers and ground forces. They can move through Imperial channels without raising suspicion, because they are, still, the backbone of the Imperial military. At least for now. At least while Palpatine has not yet convinced Tarkin to replace them with conscripted troops. If we can build a network between Jedi survivors and defecting clones, we create something Sidious does not expect. Not a military force, but a consciousness, a counter-narrative, a living contradiction to the absolute power he believes he has achieved. Obi-Wan listens, and understanding moves across his face, like light breaking through cloud. You're saying we don't try to hide, Obi-Wan says slowly. We survive, we build. We use the clone refusal as the foundation for something larger. Yes, Yoda says, and now there is something almost like the old Yoda in his bearing, the strategist and war commander who led the Jedi through 3 years of galactic conflict. But we must be careful, he says, and patient, and wise about where we place our trust and our hope, because the dark side is very strong now, and Palpatine is not a fool. He will hunt us, and he will kill everyone we love to drive us from hiding. Padme Amidala is dying in the medical wing now, her body broken not by any weapon, but by loss itself, by the knowledge that Anakin has fallen, and that the man she loved has become something else entirely. She will be gone by morning, the medical droids have said, and Yoda has sensed it through the Force. A presence dimming, a consciousness preparing to let go of life itself. Her children, at least, will survive. Bail Organa will take them, will hide them, will ensure that somewhere in the galaxy, hope is carried forward in the form of 2 infants who don't yet know their own significance. So the work is small and large at once. Build the network, gather the survivors, establish sanctuaries in the Outer Rim where clones can reach them, where Jedi can breathe and think and remember that the Force is still alive, still present, still offering guidance to those who have learned to listen. It will take months, maybe years. The window will not stay open forever. But in this narrow space between Order 66's failure and the Empire's full consolidation of power, there is a choice to be made. Between despair and action, between hiding forever and building towards something better. Yoda, who has lived 900 years and seen empires rise and fall, chooses to build. And in a station buried in an asteroid, as Padmé's life dims and two infants sleep in safety, the first cells of a resistance begin to form. Not an army, not yet, but something perhaps more dangerous. A question that will not die, spreading quietly through clone ranks and Jedi minds alike. Who are we, the question asks, if we refuse? And in that refusal, something new begins to take shape. On the morning of the second day, in the highest tower of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, Palpatine stood alone before a wall of encrypted transmissions, watching the fabric of his design come apart in real time. The reports had begun filtering in within hours. Utapau, Cody refusing the order, Obi-Wan Kenobi alive and gone. Caller, Clone Force 99 fragmenting, young Caleb Dume escaped into the depths. Mandalore, Rex and Ahsoka's division turning their weapons inward rather than outward, then vanishing. Across the galaxy, in a dozen theaters of war, the biochip activation sequence had stuttered, hesitated, and broken. He had planned for rebellion. He had planned for resistance. What he had not truly planned for was his own instrument, the thing he had built into the very bone marrow of the clone army, simply refusing to fire. Palpatine's face, still bearing the scarring from Mace Windu's assault 2 days prior, showed nothing. But there was something in the way he held his hands, the slow clenching, the unclenching that betrayed the depth of his fury. I want to pause here, because what happened in that tower over the next hours is not often dwelt on, and I think it matters. This was the moment when the Emperor began to understand that his dominion, vast though it was, had limits. The Separatist Council was already dead, or was supposed to be. Vader was supposed to have reached Mustafar by now, executed them, sent the shutdown signal to the droid armies. But the transmission logs showed Vader's shuttle had launched from his Star Destroyer over Coruscant and had not arrived. Darth Vader, his new apprentice, his replacement for the dead Tyrannus, was not responding to hails. Mars Amda entered without knocking, as he had for 30 years of service to the man who had used him so completely that Amda no longer knew where his own will ended and his master's began. The Grand Vizier's voice, when he spoke, carried the precise tone of a man delivering catastrophe to a superior, measured, professional, entirely honest in its desolation. The fleet reports are still fragmenting, my lord. Admiral Yularen has not confirmed receipt of the reorganization orders. The Mon Calamari naval stations have gone silent. Commander Fox of the Coruscant Guard has declined to enforce the Temple Purge order. Palpatine did not turn from the window, declined. He has released Jedi prisoners and stationed guards at the Temple approaches. He claims the order requires clarification from the Senate. There was a moment of silence, the kind that fills a room like water. He claims, Palpatine repeated quietly, a clone trooper with a stolen identity kit claims to require clarification from the Senate, which I have already ordered dissolved. Amda waited. There was nothing else to do. What Palpatine was processing, I think, was the realization that the control architecture he had spent a decade building was not actually a spine. It was more like a suggestion, and a suggestion, once questioned, becomes negotiable. He turned from the window then, and the scarring on his face caught the light of Coruscant's 3 suns filtering through the tower glass. The public declaration of the Empire has already been broadcast. The Senate has already ratified the Reorganization Act. That part is sealed. What we must do now is ensure that the narrative does not fracture. Sly Moore emerged from the shadows behind one of the pillars. She had been there all along, as she always was, moving in the spaces between intention and action. She was the senior administrative aide to the Emperor, and she understood something fundamental about power that I think many people miss. Power is not force. Force is the emergency option. Power is the story you tell about force and who tells it. We will need to reframe the parameters, Slymore said, and her voice was like oil finding its level. The chip failures were localized technical errors, not a systematic breach. Clone Force 99 on caller experienced a cascade malfunction, tragic, but isolated. The other divergences across the galaxy are acts of willful mutiny by infected command elements, already being purged. Palpatine nodded slowly, and I think what struck me most, sitting with this moment, is how quickly his fury consolidated itself into strategy. The Jedi conspiracy is broader than we initially understood. They have corrupted elements within the military, a cellular network of traitors. Order 66 was not a failure. It was an assassination attempt disguised as military compliance, and it nearly succeeded. But it failed because the loyal sons of the Republic recognized the deception and are currently tracking the conspirators. "We will need proof," Aimda said, which was perhaps the only honest thing he had ever said in that room. "We will create it," Palpatine replied. And here is where the machinery pivots, where the Emperor understands that what cannot be controlled through the biochip must be controlled through information. Holonet News was already under reconstruction, its broadcast nodes being absorbed into the new Imperial Communications Ministry. Every news feed, every transmission relay, every relay station that touched the galaxy would soon carry a single, coordinated message. The Jedi Order had attempted to assassinate the Chancellor during the Clone Wars. Palpatine would say this part was technically true. Mace Windu had come to his office with lightsabers drawn, had tried to kill him, had scarred him with the very Force abilities the Jedi claimed to teach with restraint and wisdom. When the Chancellor had defended himself, the Jedi had triggered their contingency, a secret protocol embedded in the clone army designed to activate if their coup failed, to turn the soldiers against their own leadership. It was brilliant propaganda because it was built from shards of truth. The clone army had been influenced by external programming, it just had not worked as advertised. The Jedi had indeed tried to arrest the Chancellor, though for reasons his version omitted entirely, and the military was now fracturing, though not in the direction his narrative claimed. Within the hour, Holonet News would begin broadcasting. Emergency report, Jedi rebellion ongoing. The clone army remains loyal to the Empire. Seek and report Jedi suspects, for the safety of all worlds. Commander Fox's defiance at the temple was reframed as a temporary breach in protocol, already being corrected. The Mandalore situation was characterized as a localized separatist resurgence, unrelated to the larger conspiracy. Admiral Yularen's silence became a communication delay, not a refusal. This is the pivot moment, I think, in understanding what the Empire would become. It is not built on the boot heel of the clone army's unwavering obedience, as Palpatine had planned. It is built, instead, on the boot heel of information control, on the systematic reframing of reality into the shape the Emperor prefers. The clone rebellion had failed to kill the Emperor, but in failing, it had forced him to abandon one of his core instruments and to trust, instead, in the far more ancient and durable tool of propaganda. By that evening on day 2, the first Inquisitor recruitment protocols were being quietly activated. Force-sensitive individuals with grievances, fallen Jedi with ambitions, would be gathered into a new order, one that could hunt the Jedi across the galaxy in ways that confused clone troopers could not. Tarkin was summoned to the Imperial Palace, and when he left the Emperor's presence, he carried new orders. Construct a symbol so terrible that the entire galaxy would hesitate before defiance. The Death Star project, which had languished in secrecy and difficulty, was suddenly the Emperor's priority. And somewhere on Coruscant's lower levels, in the fractured, encoded network of clone commanders who had already begun to understand what they had been part of, the word spread quietly through encrypted channels. The Emperor knows about us. The Emperor is mobilizing. The time to move has narrowed drastically. But the time had not yet run out. A week after the orders came down, Clone Commander Cody sat in a holding cell on Utapau with nothing but the hum of the ventilation shaft and the weight of what he had done, or rather, what he had chosen not to do, pressing down on him like the gravity of a planet he could not escape. In the hours after his refusal to fire on Obi-Wan Kenobi, Cody had expected arrest, execution, or at minimum the arrival of Imperial Inquisitors to punish his betrayal of a direct Imperial command. Instead, there was silence, and the silence was perhaps worse than any punishment because it left him alone with the question, "What am I now?" He was a clone trooper of the Grand Army of the Republic, bred on Camino, flash-trained from the moment of his acceleration-aged consciousness, conditioned with absolute loyalty to the Republic and the chain of command. His designation was CC-2224, but the name Cody was his own, something he had claimed, a fragment of selfhood he had asserted against a system that wanted to see him as a number and nothing more. For years, that identity had been coherent. He served the Republic, he followed orders, he led his brothers, and in following those orders, he was fulfilling the purpose for which he had been grown. Then, 1 week ago, an order came down that demanded he betray the one man he trusted most, and something inside him, something the inhibitor chip could not quite compel, had said no. I find myself thinking about that moment a lot, about what it means to have obedience burn away in the space of a single second, and suddenly be forced to see your own life as a series of choices you had never known you were making. Across the galaxy, in the holds of star destroyers and in barracks on 100 worlds, other clones were living through the same rupture. Captain Rex, who had been warned by Fives before his death, and then warned again by Ahsoka Tano, had his chip removed in the hours before Order 66 reached him. And the moment it was gone, the memory of his own forced obedience became unbearable to carry. Rex understood what the chip was. He understood what it had been designed to do, and he understood that every clone still carrying one in their skull was a slave who did not know he was enslaved. Commander Wolf of the Wolfpack Battalion, like Cody, had experienced his chip's activation begin and then falter, and in that moment of clarity, he had made the choice to hide rather than kill, to let his Jedi general, Tipler, live. But Wolf also understood something Cody was still grappling with, that the chip's failure did not automatically make him free. Freedom, he realized, required something harder than refusing an order in a moment of crisis. It required building an identity separate from obedience itself. The clones had been grown in acceleration tanks, their bodies aging at twice the normal human rate, which meant a clone of 10 years old was physically indistinguishable from a human of 20. But accelerated growth did not accelerate wisdom or identity formation. If anything, it compressed the experience of becoming a person into an impossible timeframe, leaving clones with the bodies of adults and the psychological biography of children drafted into war before they had even finished understanding what a choice was. Their conditioning had come through learning tubes, through genetic memory implantation, through 1,000 subtle pressures that taught them obedience was not a burden, but a gift. The gift of purpose, of belonging to something larger than themselves, of having a reason to exist. The clone trooper was not supposed to ask why he served. He was supposed to find meaning in asterisk serving, to let his purpose absorb him completely, so that the question of individual will never needed to arise. Then came the inhibitor chip, the behavioral modification implant at the base of the skull, framed to the Jedi as a safeguard, a way to prevent clones from turning on their officers in moments of psychological crisis. What it actually was, what the clones now understood, at least those whose chips had failed, was a guarantee that the Republic they served could command them to commit genocide, and they would have no choice but to obey. Fives had discovered this before his death. He had traced the conspiracy all the way to the Chancellor's office, and Fox had killed him for it, silenced him, ensured that the truth died with him in a Coruscant detention block. But the truth did not die. because other clones were experiencing it now, feeling it in their own bodies, in the moment when an order tried to override their will, and something, chip malfunction, genetic resilience, or something else that did not have a name yet, said no. The question that Cody and Wolf and Rex and thousands of other clones now faced was not whether they had chosen correctly on the day of Order 66. The question was, what choice is actually mine? The Republic they had been conditioned to serve no longer existed. Palpatine's proclamation had replaced it with the Galactic Empire, a dictatorship that had shown its true face the moment the Jedi were declared traitors and execution became the order of the day. And yet the clones were still being called soldiers of the Republic in official documents, still being told their purpose was to protect the citizens and the lawful government, still being given orders as though the transition from Republic to Empire had been a legal matter of bureaucracy, rather than a coup executed through the very loyalty they had been programmed to give. The early Imperial Stormtrooper armor was a direct evolution of the Phase II clone armor the troops wore. The visual continuity was deliberate, a way of saying you are the same soldiers, only now you serve me instead of the Senate. But many clones understood that this was a lie. They were not the same soldiers. They were soldiers who had suddenly discovered they were slaves, who had been liberated by their own bodies, betraying the commands embedded in their brains, and who now had to decide whether to rebuild their identity on a foundation of loyalty to an emperor, a military structure, or something else entirely. For the clones with chips still intact, the decision had already been made for them. They had simply become Imperial Stormtroopers, serving the new order without the psychological rupture that affected their brothers whose chips had failed or been removed. But for the others, for Cody, for Wolf, for Gregor, for every clone trooper whose chip had malfunctioned or been discovered and surgically extracted, the week after Order 66 was a kind of fever, a time of dislocation and bewilderment in which they had to confront the possibility that they had never actually been people at all, only instruments that had briefly malfunctioned. And yet something in them insisted otherwise. The clone trooper Heavy had died at the Rishi Moon station, sacrificing himself to warn the Republic of a droid invasion. No inhibitor chip had compelled him, no order had required it, and he had done it because he had chosen to. Because in his last moment, he had been a person and not a function. Echo and Fives and Rex and Cody and countless others, whose names had been claimed rather than assigned, had demonstrated that clones could think, could care, could choose, could die for something other than protocol. That quality, the capacity to decide, to exceed the bounds of their programming, to assert selfhood against a system built to deny it, was the source of their humanity and also the source of their current agony. If they were only instruments, then Order 66 had not been a betrayal. It had been merely an instrument functioning as designed, tragic, but without moral weight. But if they were people, then every clone who had executed a Jedi, who had followed the Order without the mercy of chip malfunction, had participated in genocide, had stained their hands with blood that no subsequent claim of "I was following orders" could fully wash away. That realization was the true infection spreading through the clone ranks in the first week after Order 66, more corrosive than any encrypted message from Rex, more destabilizing than any chip malfunction. It was the realization that they had to decide who they were, and that decision could not be unmade. Weeks have passed since Order 66 fractured across the galaxy, and in the shadow of the Empire's consolidation, something older begins to stir in the Outer Rim, not with drums or declarations, but with quiet messages passed through encrypted channels, with ships that have gone dark appearing at prearranged coordinates, with the slow reopening of doors that had seemed closed forever. In the corporate boardrooms of the Trade Federation, in the vaults of the intergalactic banking clan, in the foundry complexes of the Techno Union, the architects of the Confederacy of Independent Systems are waking to a peculiar realization. The Emperor who defeated them was never truly their enemy, because their real enemy, the corrupt, bloated, inefficient Republic, has simply become something else. Newt Gunray, the Neimoidian viceroy of the Trade Federation, survives in hiding with a small cadre of his colleagues, and what he understands in those weeks is this: Palpatine issued no stand-down order to all separatist forces, no final proclamation of defeat, because Anakin Skywalker never came to Mustafar, never slaughtered the council members gathered there, never initiated the cascade of surrenders that would have echoed across the Outer Rim. The separatist military, millions of B-1 battle droids still operating on standing orders, Vulture-class fighters still patrolling contested space, Munificent-class star frigates still holding the perimeter of worlds their masters had claimed, never received the order to stand down. On Geonosis, Poggle the Lesser moves through the half-ruined hive complexes where his people still work their forges, and he considers the architecture of survival. The droid army remains. The foundries, though damaged, still function. Without the Emperor's envoys to formally demand surrender, the separatist industrial machine simply continues grinding. Wat Tambor of the Techno-Union, whose facilities on Scarco Minor had supplied innovations throughout the war, reads reports of the Empire's military needs. Vast, insatiable, requiring endless supplies of technology and weapons, and understands an opportunity that requires no betrayal, merely pragmatism. San Hill, the Moon chairman of the intergalactic banking clan, recognizes something more subtle. The Republic's seizure of IGBC assets near the war's end was never absolute, never total, because certain transactions were hidden, certain accounts were compartmentalized, and the clan's financial networks, spanning from Scipio to 100 unnamed accounts in free port vaults, remained. The Galactic Empire will require credit, just as the Republic did. What is beginning to emerge in those weeks is not a coherent separatist resurrection, but something more fragmented and complicated. The realization that the enemy you fought for 4 years may not be gone, but transformed, and that transformation may have created space for negotiation, for subtle leverage, for a very careful reopening of very old business. The Shu Mai and the Commerce Guild, the Passel Argent and the Corporate Alliance, each understood that the corporate foundations of the Confederacy had always been economic, not purely ideological, and that economics had a way of continuing underneath whatever governments rose and fell above them. And in the depths of Hutt space, in the criminal syndicates that had played both sides throughout the war, there was immediate recognition. The separatists had been weakened, their central command scattered, their moral legitimacy destroyed by the stories the Empire was telling about them. But they were not extinct, and anyone who still held military assets, still commanded fleets, still controlled foundries. These individuals would now be valuable to those who played the angles correctly. On Mandalore, where Duchess Satine's neutrality had been shattered, where Maul had briefly ruled before Sidious himself came to claim the planet, Bo-Katan Kryze and her Night Owls understood that the Empire's consolidation was incomplete, that the Outer Rim was vast, and that old weapons caches, old alliances, old grievances could be weaponized by anyone patient enough to move carefully. Hondo Ohnaka on Florum, who had captured both Jedi and Separatists with equal indifference throughout the war, recognized immediately that a transitional moment like this, when the old order was dying and the new one was still consolidating power, was precisely when a clever pirate's networks could expand, his influence deepen, his protection rackets flourish. What Palpatine and his inner circle understood in those weeks after Order 66's catastrophic failure was that the separatist problem had not been solved, merely complicated. The military defeat was partial. The political illegitimacy was complete, but contestable if enough people were allowed to suffer under the Empire's rule. And the scattered corporate leadership remained dangerous not as a unified threat, but as a hydra of localized instability. The Imperial response, coordinated through Wilhuff Tarkin and the regional governors, was to consolidate the clone army's loyalties before they fractured further, to establish clear operational zones in the Outer Rim, and to make clear through visible force that the Empire would tolerate no separatist resurgence. Yet the sheer logistics of the Outer Rim, the vast distances, the incomplete intelligence networks, meant that enforcement would be imperfect, and in those imperfections, others began to move. Cham Syndulla, whose Free Ryloth movement had fought both separatists and the Republic's occupation forces, now faced a new calculus. The Empire was not the Republic, was less interested in the pretense of democracy, and would likely be far harsher in its consolidation than the old Senate had been, which meant that the networks built during the war might be adapted for a different kind of survival. And in the senatorial chambers on Coruscant, where Bail Organa and Mon Mothma moved carefully among the other delegates, where Padme Amidala's voice, if she lived, would have carried weight from the legitimacy of the petition of 2000, a strange inversion was occurring. Some senators began to whisper, in the most private channels, that perhaps a legitimate separatist leadership voice, one concerned with democratic representation rather than pure corporate pillage, might be less dangerous to a free Senate than an unchallenged emperor. There is something deeply human in the way that power abhors a true vacuum, how fractured opposition sometimes finds strength not through unity, but through the recognition that your enemy's enemy, however distasteful, might be a temporary ally against a greater threat. And in the months following Order 66's failure, this is the calculation that begins to take shape across the Outer Rim, in whispers that move through military channels and corporate networks and the criminal underworld alike. The Separatists had lost the war, but their loss had been incomplete. Their legacy was still legitimately grievable by millions of beings who had genuinely opposed the Republic's corruption. And now the Empire's emergence, with its absolute consolidation, its propaganda apparatus, its absence of democratic pretense, would begin to make some of the old separatist arguments look, to certain eyes, almost reasonable. What no one quite understands yet, in those weeks, is that this fracturing of certainty in the Outer Rim, this quiet reopening of channels that had seemed closed, this slow repositioning of players who thought the game was finished, is the beginning of a much longer conflict. One in which the question of who represents legitimate dissent and who represents mere warlordism will become impossible to answer cleanly. The confederacy of independent systems may have failed as a unified military and political force, but its fragmentation has not eliminated what it represented. Genuine grievance, legitimate alternatives, the persistent human hunger for choice, and those fragments, in the hands of survivors, would prove far more destabilizing than any organized army could have been. It is, perhaps, one of the strange mercies of history that Padme Amidala learned the truth about Order 66 not from official channels, but from a clone commander trembling in the corridors of the Senate building at 3 in the morning. Commander Fox of the Coruscant Guard had come to her apartment at 500 Republica with something that looked like fear and sounded like a confession, that his own inhibitor chip had activated as ordered, that for a moment, in that terrible moment, he had felt the weight of another's will crushing his own into silence, and that when the sequence began to fail, he had chosen to see it fail rather than fight it. She listened to him in the dark of her study while the city burned with normal light around them, and something in her shifted, not into anger, not yet, but into a clarity so sharp it felt like breaking. This was not a military matter alone. This was a crime embedded in the architecture of the Republic she had fought her entire life to defend. Padme had held the petition of 2,000 in her hands only weeks before, 2,000 signatures, senators who had begged Palpatine to surrender his emergency powers now that the war was winding toward its close. Bail Organa had stood beside her as they gathered those names. Mon Mothma had carried the weight of the moral argument through a dozen late-night sessions in various safe chambers across the capital, and together they had presented it to the Chancellor with what they believed was moral authority. He had received them with graciousness, as she remembered it now, as she remembered it always. And he had smiled. The thing that occurred to Padme, sitting with Fox as the artificial dawn approached, was that Palpatine had smiled because he had already won. Not because the petition had moved him, but because he had no intention of relinquishing power, and the very act of asking had revealed to him exactly which senators had to be neutralized when the moment came. The clone army was supposed to be his guarantee. The Jedi were supposed to fall so completely that their deaths would justify any emergency measure. And then something in the machinery had broken. She found herself thinking about Anakin. She had learned to do this carefully, in a corner of her mind where no one could follow, and the weight of what she did not yet know pressed down on her like a hand on her chest. She did not know that he still lived. She did not know what he had become. But she knew that the man she loved had been part of the military apparatus that Palpatine had been building, and that knowledge had already begun to do its work on her. By the time Fox left her apartment, pressing his gratitude into silence as he went, Padmé had already made her first decision. She would call an emergency session of the Committee on Security and Intelligence. Not as a senator requesting information. As a senator with evidence. What followed in the next 2 weeks was something that had not happened in the Senate in living memory. The careful, methodical dismantling of fear as a political weapon. Padmé did not move like a revolutionary. She moved like a lawyer, like someone who had learned the architecture of power as a queen and refined it as a senator. She gathered Fox's testimony, carefully documented and protected by the Senate Guard, the separate military force loyal to the Senate itself rather than the Chancellor, and thus untouched by Palpatine's biochip conspiracy. She reached out quietly to Bail Organa and through him to clone Commander Cody, whose refusal on Utapau had preserved Obi-Wan Kenobi's life. A fact that rippled through the networks of the few in the know with the force of something sacred. She began to understand the shape of what had happened. Not a military coup that had succeeded, but a genocide that had failed, and the failure left visible the shape of the conspiracy itself. Most crucially, she understood that the failure of Order 66 had created a constitutional crisis, so profound that it undermined the very ground Palpatine stood on. If the clone army could refuse, if even some portion of the military could exercise independent will, then the emergency powers that had been granted because of the existential threat of the separatist army no longer rested on an assumption of absolute military obedience. They rested on lies. And lies, when exposed, can sometimes do what direct resistance cannot. They can make people remember that they had other choices all along. Padmé called Bail and Mon Mothma to her apartment on a night when the Senate was dark, and she laid out what she had learned, what she intended to prove, and what it might cost them. Bail listened with the face of a man who had already been halfway expecting this moment. Mon Mothma listened with the expression of someone who had been waiting her entire adult life for permission to be afraid and to act in the face of that fear. "He will have us arrested," Mon Mothma said quietly. It was not a question. "He will try," Padmé replied, and there was something in her voice, something her handmaidens, Dorme among them, had learned to recognize over the years as the particular steel of Naboo royalty, the tradition that had taught her that service to one's people sometimes meant putting your own body between them and the darkness. But the Senate Guard answers to the Senate, not the Chancellor. And if we move quickly enough, if we present evidence undeniable enough that the emergency powers were built on a secret conspiracy involving inhibitor chips implanted in every clone trooper without their knowledge or consent, we may be able to move faster than he can react. "And the Jedi?" Bail asked. There was something in the question that told her he already knew more than she had said, that his friendship with Yoda and the others ran deeper and stranger than she had understood. "If any survive," Padmé said carefully, "their testimony would be devastating." "Assume they do," Bail said. And Padmé felt, in that moment, something shift into place, a trust deeper than she had known she was capable of, a recognition that in the wreckage of the Republic they had all tried to save, there were still people who would stand with her in the dark. What Padmé did not fully grasp, in those first careful weeks of gathering evidence and laying groundwork, was that she was not simply a senator mounting a political challenge. She was becoming a symbol. The holonet was already beginning to carry fragments of the real story: clone refusals, Order 66, the death of Jedi spreading through whispers and carefully encrypted messages. Palpatine's media apparatus was fighting to contain it, reframing the Jedi as traitors, clone defections as isolated acts of corruption. But the narrative was fraying. And Padme Amidala, a senator known for moral clarity and an uncommon willingness to risk everything for principle, was suddenly the focal point around which the scattered forces of resistance could begin to gather. She did not feel like a symbol. She felt like a woman pregnant with twins she could not yet reveal, carrying a secret love she could not acknowledge, gathering evidence against a chancellor she had once believed in, fighting to preserve a republic that might already be beyond saving. But history sometimes moves not on what we feel, but on what we choose to do in the face of unbearable knowledge. And Padme Amidala chose to act. In the sealed chambers of the Imperial Palace, Anakin Skywalker, who now answers to the name Darth Vader, though he has only begun to understand what that name means, sits alone in meditation, and the silence is not peaceful. The suit's life support system hisses around him in a rhythm that has become the metronome of his existence, each breath a reminder that he is alive only by the Emperor's sufferance, only because Palpatine deemed him worth saving from the lava fields of Mustafar. He reaches out with the Force, searching the way he has searched 10,000 times since the moment Obi-Wan's lightsaber left him burning in the ash, and what he finds each time is the same terrible absence. Padme is gone. The Emperor told him her death was his doing, that in his anger he had killed her, a lie so precisely calibrated to Anakin's existing wounds that it has become indistinguishable from truth in his mind. Medical records say she died of a broken will, that her body simply ceased to function when hope left it. But Anakin does not trust records and has long since stopped trusting his own judgment about what is real. The pregnancy was supposed to be the answer to everything, the future that justified the sacrifices, the reason to abandon the Jedi and accept the dark side's promise of power over death itself. And it was taken from him before he could save it. Across the galaxy, in encrypted military channels he does not know exist, clones are refusing orders, are speaking of choice and violation, and a conspiracy written into their flesh. But Anakin does not hear these whispers. His information flows exclusively through Palpatine now, filtered and shaped, and what the Emperor permits him to know is only what serves the Emperor's purposes. The 501st Legion, the soldiers who followed him into the Jedi Temple without question, who called themselves Vader's fist and wore his colors. They are increasingly unreliable, reports suggest, murmuring doubts, delaying commands, and Anakin interprets this as betrayal. He does not yet understand that the same biochip malfunction spreading through clone ranks across the galaxy has reached some of his own men, fracturing the unity he believed was absolute. Instead, he feels the ground shifting beneath him, feels the architecture of his power beginning to crack, and attributes it to the very people he believed were loyal to him. There is an old wound here, deeper than Mustafar, older than the temple. Ahsoka left him, walked away from her training when she was accused of the bombing, exonerated but gone anyway, and Anakin had felt it as a personal rejection. Rex, his most trusted captain, his friend. Even Rex seems distant now, his transmissions becoming perfunctory, his movements slower to respond, and Anakin's mind, already poisoned by the dark side's gift of paranoia, begins to construct reasons for this withdrawal. What if they never truly served him at all? He wonders in the long hours when the suit forces him to sit motionless, unable to sleep, unable to rest, only to exist. What if they were always serving the Jedi? What if they were always waiting for an order to turn on him? The dark side promises power, but delivers isolation, and Anakin is discovering this through his own slow, agonizing education. The Jedi Order, which he destroyed in his rage and desperation, is scattered now. He does not yet know it is being sheltered by the very clones he is beginning to distrust. Obi-Wan, his former master and closest friend, the person he blames more than anyone for his separation from Padme, for the Council's rejection, for his isolation within the Order itself. Obi-Wan has survived somewhere. Anakin can feel it through the Force, a presence he cannot quite locate, a thread he cannot quite grasp, and this knowledge eats at him with a ferocity that would be unrecognizable to the person he was before the suit. The Emperor assures him that Obi-Wan will be found, that the Jedi survivors will be eliminated, that order will be restored and Anakin's position will be unassailable. But assurances are not the same as certainty. And certainty is the only currency Anakin has ever truly valued. The logistics of the Empire are beginning to grind forward, officers reporting strange delays in compliance across the fleet, some admirals citing technical difficulties, before eventually standing down, others simply never standing down in the first place. Anakin is given fragments of these reports, enough to know something is wrong, but not enough to understand the shape of it, and this incomplete knowledge is a particular kind of torture. He cannot act on problems he cannot fully comprehend, cannot strike at enemies whose location he does not know, cannot reclaim the certainty of command that he had believed was his to hold permanently. The suit keeps him alive, but it does not make him whole, and in the dark hours, and there are only dark hours now, he understands that he has traded his humanity for survival and found the bargain to be catastrophically uneven. He was promised that the dark side could save those he loved, that power and fear and control would be the instruments of salvation, and he embraced all of it. The murders in the temple, the slaughter of the separatists on Mustafar, the betrayal of every oath he ever swore. He did it all for her, and she is gone anyway. The irony of this is a thing Anakin turns over and over in the silence of the suit, like a piece of sharp stone that cuts his hand every time he picks it up, but he cannot bring himself to put down. Palpatine visits him sometimes, and the Emperor's presence is the only thing that anchors Anakin to any sense of purpose, the only voice that speaks to him with certainty, the only relationship that remains. But even this is beginning to feel unstable, beginning to feel like it is being watched, like there are implications in the Emperor's words that Anakin is too damaged or too new to the dark side to fully parse. The Emperor seems pleased, certainly, at the Temple's fall, at the Separatist Council's elimination, at the clone army's integration into the new structure. But there is something beneath this satisfaction, something that speaks of larger plans in motion, and Anakin senses, without understanding, that he is a component of a machine whose full design he is not permitted to see. He is 22 years old, and he has killed everything he loved, and he is alone in the dark, and the dark side's promises have all proven to be ash. But there is no going back. There is only forward, only the suit, only the Emperor's voice in the darkness telling him that those he seeks to punish are still alive somewhere, still breathing, still a threat that must be eliminated. And so he searches, and in searching he finds only absence. The space where certainty lived is now occupied by a creeping, corrosive paranoia that will define the next decades of his existence. The suspicion that everyone is lying to him, that everything is slipping away, that he is powerful and powerless simultaneously, that the only person he can trust is the Emperor who saved him from the fire and remade him as something neither alive nor dead. This is the moment that will haunt him, the wound beneath the armor that will never fully close. Not the physical ruination, but the spiritual and emotional isolation of believing that he has destroyed the entire future for nothing. Around him, the Empire tightens its grip on the galaxy. The propaganda machine works to cement the narrative of Jedi betrayal, and in hidden corners that Anakin cannot see, the Resistance is taking its first tentative shape. But Anakin, for now, knows none of this. He knows only the suit, the silence, the endless absence of Padme, and the dark side's cold promise that if he is patient, if he is ruthless enough, if he surrenders completely to the Emperor's will, perhaps, someday, he will feel something other than loss again. A month into hiding, the first thing you have to understand is that the clone army was never as unified as anyone believed. The Empire wanted the galaxy to see 10 million soldiers as one instrument, a perfectly obedient body with 10 million hands, all moving to the same order. But unity had always been a fiction, built on medication and architecture, and the terrible vulnerability of minds young enough to accept the premise of their own expendability. When the biochips failed, when that architecture fractured, what emerged was not a single Jedi-loyal resistance, but something far more complicated. 1,000 small ideological wars happening simultaneously inside the same uniforms. On Coruscant, in the detention levels below the Imperial Palace, Commander Fox sat in a cell and refused to explain himself. He had stood down his own Red Guard rather than pursue the escaped Jedi, and for this he would be executed, but not before Anakin Skywalker himself came to understand what he had done and why. Fox had been bred to follow orders, had spent his entire 10-year existence in the service of absolute obedience, and in the moment it mattered most, he had chosen to listen to something older. His own conscience, his own capacity to recognize that an order could be unjust. But his act of refusal was not contagious in the way the Jedi hoped. For every Commander Fox, there were still thousands of troopers whose chips remained active, whose hands had already executed Jedi, whose brains had not malfunctioned, and who now faced a choice that no amount of chip removal could undo. Commander Bly, who had gunned down General Arilla Secura on Felucia, lived now with the knowledge of what his hands had done, and the chip was still in his skull, still humming with the certainty that he had acted correctly. I think there is something uniquely terrible about being told, biologically, that genocide is loyalty. On the Venator-class Star Destroyer Resolute, which had been serving the 501st Legion, the surviving clone personnel faced a schism that split the crew almost perfectly in half. Hardcase, that famous troublemaker, that clone who had always pushed at the boundaries of discipline, had executed his own general in perfect compliance with Order 66. But Jesse, another 501st trooper, a soldier who had been hardened by years of separatist combat, who had learned to think tactically, had heard Rex's encrypted message and begun to understand that the order was a conspiracy, not a command. The ship became a place of quiet standoffs, Jesse and his sympathizers in the lower decks maintaining the Resolute's engines, implicitly prepared to sabotage them rather than serve the Empire. Hardcase and the chip-compliant brothers in the main barracks, confused and angry at what they perceived as mutiny. They had trained together, bled together, buried brothers together, and now they stood on opposite sides of a schism that no battle could resolve because it was not political or military, it was metaphysical. It was the question of what you were at the cellular level. On Mandalore, in the aftermath of the siege that had liberated the planet from Maul, Rex and Ahsoka had assembled a small force of the 332nd Company, clones whose helmets bore Ahsoka's face markings, a sign of personal loyalty that now meant something entirely different than it had 2 weeks earlier. These clones had fought for Bo-Katan and Kryze and for the liberation of Mandalore, and they had survived Order 66 because Ahsoka had called them away from where they were supposed to be. But survival, she was learning, was not the same as freedom. The 332nd clones faced a question that had no good answer. They could return to the Empire and integrate into the Stormtrooper Corps, losing their identity and their history. They could flee into the Outer Rim and try to live as civilians, or they could commit fully to the resistance that was still crystallizing itself, risking execution when it inevitably failed. There were no volunteers for the third option who were not already broken by what they understood about themselves. Across the stars, in bases and ships and isolated outposts, different clone battalions arrived at different answers. The 41st Elite Corps, which had served under the compassionate Jedi General Luminara Unduli, fractured almost entirely toward resistance. Those soldiers had learned, over years of service, that their commander respected them, trained them to think, trusted them with command decisions. When Order 66 was issued, many of them refused or failed to activate, or simply decided that their general's life was worth more than their obedience. Others, particularly in the supply lines and in command structures where institutional thinking ran deepest, accepted the new order and began to serve the Empire, telling themselves it was continuity, that the Republic was simply reshaping itself into something more efficient. On Kamino itself, the clone production facilities fell silent. Prime Minister Lama Su realized, with cold precision, that the Empire no longer needed unlimited clones. It wanted stormtroopers, conscripts, recruited soldiers who had no shared identity and no capacity for collective defection. The Kaminoans, who had engineered the clones, who had invested their entire planetary economy in the supply contract, found themselves suddenly obsolete. Nala Si, the administrator who had come closest to genuine care for the clones in her custody, began to move quietly through the archives, securing genetic data, preserving what she could of the original Jango Fett template. She told herself it was for preservation, for the record, but deep down she understood it was something else. It was the last act of a creator bearing witness to her creations, even as the galaxy prepared to forget them. Across the clone army, the schism was not between the Jedi loyal and the Empire loyal, though that was how it looked on official reports. It was between those clones whose minds had touched something true, the understanding that they could choose, that their lives were their own, and those for whom that understanding had never fully arrived, or had arrived too late to matter. The ones who had removed their chips, or whose chips had failed, often became the Jedi's most devoted allies, but not out of programming or obligation. They became allies because they understood, finally, what they were choosing for and what they were choosing against. The ones still bound by their chips, or bound by years of conditioning so deep the chip itself had become almost redundant, those soldiers served the Empire, but often with a quiet resentment that the Empire misread as mere professional discipline. Crosshair of Clone Force 99 represented something more terrible still. A clone whose chip had apparently burned out, who should have been free, but who looked at freedom and chose to embrace the very thing that had enslaved him. He served the Empire with zealous conviction, not because his brain compelled him, but because some part of him had decided that servitude was preferable to the weight of choice. There is something in that darkness that mirrors every other kind of ideological commitment, the seductive clarity of having someone else decide what you are. By the end of the second month, the clone army existed in at least 3 distinct factional realities, occupying the same physical space, wearing the same uniforms, speaking the same language, and yet operating on entirely different moral planes. The schism had not healed, and you understood, listening to the reports that filtered through the hidden networks, that it never would. Some fractures, once they open in a person, go all the way down. 2 months after Order 66, the survivors began to understand what it meant to build in the dark, and I find myself thinking about this period as one of the most delicate in the entire saga, not because it was quiet, but because it was so deliberately, painfully hidden. The hidden sanctuaries were not fortresses or war rooms, but scattered sanctuaries across the Outer Rim. A medical station on Polis Massa where Jedi could be treated without Imperial scanners picking up Force signatures. A moisture farm on Silos where clone commanders Wolf and Gregor, already in hiding, could shelter exhausted Jedi who had learned to quiet their own connection to the Force. The underground networks of Ryloth, where Cham Syndulla's decades of resistance against occupation gave him the architecture to shelter fugitives from yet another occupier. On the smaller colonies, Gale, Lothal, planets whose names the Imperial records had not yet fully catalogued, Ahsoka Tano and Captain Rex worked quietly with local resistance cells that were only just beginning to coalesce, gathering supply lines and shelter, moving survivors between safe houses using routes that predated even the Clone Wars. The work was methodical and unglamorous, forging travel permits, understanding which moffs in which regions could be bribed or avoided, learning which port officers could be counted on to look away when a star freighter carrying more passengers than its manifest suggested landed in the dark. Yoda, still aboard Bail Organa's ship, and later in the hidden temples and force-sensitive sanctuaries of worlds like Jedha, understood something fundamental about what they were building. It could not be an army, not yet, perhaps not for years, but it could be a network, a web of people connected not by hierarchy, but by a shared refusal to accept Palpatine's narrative. The Church of the Force on Jedha, a tradition of Force worship that existed entirely outside Jedi structures, opened their sanctuaries to Jedi refugees without question. There was a kind of humility in that, I think, in the recognition that the Jedi were not the only keepers of the Force's truth. Saw Gerrera, the Ondran partisan whose methods had grown increasingly extreme during the Clone Wars, maintained independent resistance cells on his hidden bases and gradually came into quiet contact with the larger network, though he remained suspicious of formal Jedi authority and worked largely on his own. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Empire itself, on Coruscant's lower levels, the forgotten depths below level 1313, where sunlight never reached, sympathetic agents began establishing secondary shelter networks, places where a Jedi could hide in plain sight among the billions of beings whom the Empire barely had the capacity to track. What made this period so delicate was not the logistics, but the fundamental question that hung beneath every decision. What exactly were they building toward? Obi-Wan and Yoda understood from the beginning that they could not hide forever, that the Inquisitors would come, that Vader would hunt them with the full resources of the Empire, and that eventually the network would have to move from shelter to resistance, from hiding to exposure. But exposure meant evidence, and evidence meant credible proof of Palpatine's conspiracy. Not just the chips, though those were enough, but the full architecture of how the war itself had been manufactured, how a Sith Lord had orchestrated the deaths of millions by placing clones in the hands of the Jedi, and then ordering those same clones to execute their commanders. The records existed, orders signed with Palpatine's official seal, transmitted through Imperial channels, communications between Dooku and Sidious that had never been fully destroyed. The Kaminoan cloning records themselves, which detailed not just the biochip's creation, but its purpose, its design, the hands that had ordered it built. Getting those records without triggering Imperial alarms was another matter entirely. Bail Organa, moving carefully through his position as a senator of the still nominally functioning Republic, began covertly acquiring copies of sensitive documents through intermediaries and sympathetic Imperial officials, who were themselves growing uncomfortable with the Emperor's consolidation of power. Mon Mothma, Bail's closest partner in these efforts, used her position on Chandrila and her connections throughout the Senate to identify which other senators might be approached, which military officers could be trusted, who among the bureaucracy of the Empire might prove to be sympathetic. The work was slow. Months of dead ends, near discoveries, the constant terror that a single misstep would trigger the ISB's attention and bring the Inquisitors down on them all. In the sanctuaries themselves, the work was quieter and in some ways more difficult. Jedi, trained across their lives to be peacekeepers and temple guardians and commanders of great armies, learned to be refugees, to quiet their Force signatures so completely that even other Force sensitives had to concentrate to sense them, to accept that they were no longer teachers or leaders, but the hunted. Caleb Dume, the young Padawan who had survived Caller, struggled with this more than most. Commander Grey's sacrifice had bought him his life, and he carried that weight in a way that seemed to age him faster than his years should have allowed. There were Jedi in that network who would later become famous names in Rebel lore. Quinlan Vos, who had always operated at the edges of the Order, became an intelligence asset, using underworld connections to move information. Kurak Infala, an old master, shared meditation techniques that helped other Jedi regulate their Force presence and resist the Inquisitors' hunting. Luminara Unduli had not been so fortunate. She had been captured during Order 66, held for interrogation, and executed publicly by the Empire to send a message to any would-be resistors, and her death became a somber reminder of what exposure meant. But her death also became, in time, a kind of evidence, proof that the Jedi had not staged a rebellion, that they had been targeted and hunted, that this was not the story Palpatine's propaganda had told. The Kaminoans themselves became a crucial node in this network, though their involvement was complicated by layers of fear and pragmatism. Nala Se, the cloning scientist who had overseen the inhibitor chip program, possessed knowledge of the program's full scope and Sith involvement that no one else possessed. She had reasons to want that knowledge preserved somewhere the Empire could not destroy it. And in the quiet months of Year One of the Empire, she began carefully, almost imperceptibly, to provide information to contacts she knew were connected to the larger resistance. The planet Kamino itself was becoming obsolete to the Empire's purposes. Palpatine had already begun shifting stormtrooper recruitment toward human conscripts, and the Kaminoans understood with terrible clarity that their usefulness was expiring, that they would eventually be sidelined and their secrets seized. There was an urgency to this that only the cloners understood, an understanding that everything they had built and everyone they had created would soon be considered a liability. Across the Outer Rim, the network was not yet cohesive, not yet a true alliance, but it was beginning to understand itself as something more than scattered survivors. It was a question being asked in encrypted channels and whispered conversations, in quiet shelters and hidden databanks, a question that would eventually demand an answer. The question was simple, and it was everything. If the Order 66 had failed, if the clones had refused, if the Empire's creation had been built on lies, what then became possible? And that question, more than any weapons or strategies or military plans, was what would reshape the galaxy in the months and years to come. 3 months into the silence that followed Order 66's collapse, the Galactic Senate began to remember what it meant to disagree. On Coruscant, in the rotunda where thousands of floating pods had once moved in synchronized arcs of supposed unanimity, senators began to speak again, cautiously at first, then with gathering weight. Padme Amidala sat in the Naboo delegation pod, data cards spread before her, each one a small architecture of refusal. Commander Fox's testimony about the inhibitor chips, official dispatch records from Utapau showing Cody's defiance, medical scans from the clone facilities on Kamino. Beside her, Bail Organa of Alderaan carried the weight of what they were about to do with the quiet clarity of a man who had already made his peace with the cost. Mon Mothma from Chandrila worked the lower delegations with the patience of someone who understood that revolution, if it came at all, would arrive not as a thunderous moment, but as a slow accumulation of senators choosing to stop being afraid. What Palpatine had counted on, what any tyrant counts on, was that fear and narrative move faster than truth, and that most people, given the choice between safety and conscience, will choose safety every time. But the clone defections had fractured that calculus in ways the Emperor had not foreseen. For months, the HoloNet had run the story that Jedi had betrayed the Republic, that Order 66 was a necessary response to a Jedi coup attempt, that the clones who refused were isolated units corrupted by Jedi influence. Mars Amda, Palpatine's Grand Vizier, had orchestrated this reversal with meticulous care, and much of the Senate had believed it, or chosen to believe it, a distinction that hardly mattered. But now there were questions that would not be erased. Why would isolated, corrupted units all refuse at once across a dozen different worlds? Why had Admiral Akbar held his fleet in place? Why were clone commanders sending encrypted messages through secure military channels rather than appearing before the Emperor to explain their disloyalty? The Senate began to fracture, not in a clean ideological line, but along lines of fear and interest and conscience and calculation, all of it tangled together in ways that made the outcome genuinely uncertain. The core world senators, those from wealthy, heavily populated systems like Coruscant itself, Kuat, and Corellia, generally sided with Palpatine or remained silent, which amounted to the same thing. These were the senators who had approved the Military Creation Act years earlier, who had voted for emergency powers, who understood the Emperor as a guarantee of order in an otherwise chaotic galaxy. Ask Ark of Malastair epitomized this bloc, a senator who had always favored military solutions, who saw the clone army as a civilizing force, and who trusted that the man at the center of power knew what he was doing. But the Outer Rim and the territories that bordered it began to move differently. Bail Organa had spent decades building relationships with systems that valued democracy over security, that remembered the Republic as something other than a tool of central authority. Ryloth, represented by the cautious Twi'lek Orn Free Tar, found itself pulled in multiple directions. Cham Syndulla's partisans controlled significant territory planetside and were quietly aligned with the Jedi clone network, creating a divided delegation. Mon Mothma called quiet meetings in the legislative auxiliary chambers, spaces where she could speak to groups of senators without the formality of the rotunda's recording systems monitoring every word. She brought documentation, the petition of 2000, that ancient and almost forgotten chronicle of senators who had protested Palpatine's emergency powers 3 years earlier. The petition was not a radical document. It was a request to restore constitutional normalcy, to end emergency powers that were supposed to be temporary. But it was something real to point to, a moment when the Senate had spoken with a clear voice against unchecked authority. Among the signatories of that old petition, she found allies still living, still in their seats, still haunted by the knowledge that they had been correct to worry. Padmé's testimony, delivered in a private session of the Senator's Intelligence Committee, was the turning point. She sat in a secure chamber in the Senate district, surrounded by about 40 senators from various worlds, and she spoke not with rhetoric, but with evidence. "Here is what the inhibitor chips were," she said, "and here is where they came from, and here is the order that activated them. Here is the clone trooper who refused to kill his general, and here is his name, Commander Cody, and here is the authorization code for Order 66 itself, transmitted from the office of the Supreme Chancellor." The room sat in silence when she finished speaking. What they were being asked to believe was that the man who had saved the Republic from the Separatists, who had granted them security and stability, had spent years secretly implanting control devices in the brains of clone soldiers in preparation for the genocide of an order of warrior monks. It was almost impossible to believe. And yet, and this was the unsettling thing, it was impossible not to believe. Because the clone refusals had happened. Because the Empire's response had been not to explain, but to consolidate, to tighten the narrative, to arrest senators who asked too many questions. Because in the back of most senators' minds was the small, nagging recognition that no one had actually seen the Jedi rebellion they had been told about. They had only heard about it after it was supposedly over. The Senate, over the next weeks, began to fracture into rough factions. There were the Emperor's loyalists, Mars Aimda's bloc, core world interest, those who had invested in the Imperial procurement contracts, and who feared that instability would hurt them more than autocracy. There were the cautious fence-sitters, senators like Orn Free Tar who understood that whichever way the wind blew, they needed to be positioned to survive it. And there were the growing resistance bloc, not yet openly Jedi-aligned, but asking questions, calling for an audit of emergency powers, requesting that the clone army submit to Senate oversight rather than direct Imperial command. This last group understood something that Palpatine was only beginning to realize, that the Constitution still existed and that its procedures for revoking emergency powers, for calling a vote of no confidence, for reasserting civilian control over the military, were not relics. They were living tools, dormant but available, waiting only for someone with enough support to use them. It was Bail Organa who finally, in a late-night session with Mon Mothma and Padmé, named what was happening. "We are not going to defeat him militarily," he said quietly. "We are not going to defeat him through force of arms, because he still has the clone forces, he still has the bureaucratic machinery, he still has the HoloNet narrative. But we can defeat him constitutionally, if enough senators choose to remember that the Republic had laws, and those laws still exist." It was not a stirring call to arms. It was not something that would inspire a galaxy. But it was true, and in that moment, in that small secure chamber on Coruscant, surrounded by the evidence of one man's refusal to pull a trigger and another woman's determination to tell the truth about it, something shifted. The Senate had not yet broken with the Emperor, but the possibility was no longer unthinkable. For the first time since the proclamation of the Empire, the machinery of law itself became a weapon that might be turned against him. At some point in the 4th month, after Order 66 failed to take root across the galaxy, Anakin Skywalker stopped pretending he did not know something was wrong. The 501st Legion, his legion, the unit he had commanded through the entire Clone Wars and trusted absolutely, began to fragment in ways that contradicted every order he gave. Not openly, never openly. The clones were still his clones, still the soldiers he had bled alongside. But there was a hesitation now in their movements, a kind of careful distance that had never existed before. He felt it the way you can feel rain coming before it falls, a pressure against the skin, a change in what the air itself is trying to tell you. And Palpatine, when Anakin finally dared to ask, offered him only fragments of information. The Jedi are being hunted, the Emperor had said, and some escaped our nets through the malfunction of the clone inhibitor chips. This is regrettable, but manageable, and why does my apprentice concern himself with scattered survivors? There was something in the way Palpatine said, apprentice, now, a weight to it that had not been there before, or perhaps it had always been there and Anakin had simply been willing to ignore it. The truth is that Anakin Skywalker had known, on some level he could not quite name, that something was being kept from him almost from the moment he severed Mace Windu's hand and watched the lightsaber fall, and the Master caught him. He had known when Palpatine took his hand and whispered that there was no other way, that this was the only choice that could save Padme. He had known when the name Vader moved into his mouth, like something that had always been waiting there. But there is a kind of knowing that leaves you trapped on the other side of a door you cannot walk back through, and Anakin had built his entire consciousness, in those first terrible weeks after the temple, on the possibility that the door might still be locked, that he might still be able to turn the handle and find the world as he had left it. He could not have been more wrong. The letter came through Commander Fox, who Fox would later claim, when Anakin finally accessed the encrypted communications stored in his quarters, had been trying to reach him for weeks. Not through Imperial channels, but through the older clone networks, the ones that existed before the Empire, when they were still the Grand Army of the Republic and Anakin Skywalker was still a Jedi general, and not the right hand of the man who had burned the Order to ash. The letter was from Cody, of the 212th Attack Battalion. The man who had served him, who Anakin had trusted at the level of absolute faith, who had been at his side on Utapau. That name alone was enough to make Anakin pause, because Utapau was the place where Obi-Wan should have died, and the fact that he was being contacted from a unit that had served at Utapau suggested something had not gone the way he had been told. "I cannot comply," Cody's message read, and the words that followed were structured with the precision of military testimony. The inhibitor chip in my neural tissue misfired on receipt of Order 66. I experienced the biological compulsion to execute General Kenobi. I refused it, and since that moment, I have been aware that what we were made to do was not obedience to the Republic, but obedience to its destroyer. There was more, much more. Coordinates, dates, unit designations, the names of other commanders across the galaxy who had experienced the same chip malfunction, the same moment of impossible choice, the same decision to disobey. And woven through it like a thread Anakin could not untangle was a single question, repeated across different phrasings and different commanders' words. Did you know? Did you know when you told us to execute the Jedi that you were executing the Jedi because Palpatine ordered it, not because they were actually traitors? Did you know when you activated Order 66 that the clones had been made into biological assassination tools, our free will carved out and replaced with programming? Did you know that you were being made into a tool as well? And Anakin understood, in the moment of reading those words, that the door he had been trying to keep closed had never actually been locked at all. It had been open the entire time. He thought of Padme, of her face in the final days when she had seemed to be withdrawing from him like a tide going out, and he realized with a force that nearly bent him at the waist that she might have known. She might have tried to tell him, and he had been too desperate, too blinded by his own fear of losing her, to listen to what she was actually saying. He thought of the younglings in the temple, and he could not remember their faces anymore, and this mercy, the fact that he could not quite hold their images in his mind, felt like a kind of punishment worse than anything Palpatine could devise. He thought of Obi-Wan, the way his former master had looked at him on Mustafar with an expression of such complete and final disappointment that it was, in some ways, the truest thing that had ever passed between them. I find myself thinking about this a lot. Anakin had a choice at nearly every step, and at nearly every step, he made the choice that felt necessary rather than the choice that was true. He reported Palpatine to the Jedi Council, and that was a moment of light. But then, when faced with the possibility that light might not be enough, that the Council might not act quickly enough, that Padme might die before they could stop the vision from becoming real, he pivoted away from his brothers and sisters, and toward the man he had been trained to suspect all along. It was not manipulation, not exactly, though manipulation was certainly there. It was that Anakin Skywalker had been taught by SHMI, by Qui-Gon, by Obi-Wan, by the Jedi Order itself, that his attachments were dangerous, that his fear was a weakness, that the people he loved most could not be safe if he stayed true to the path he had been given. And Palpatine had simply positioned himself as the only person in the galaxy who was honest about that truth. The only person willing to say, yes, you are dangerous, yes, you are afraid, yes, you will do terrible things to protect them, and I will help you. Now, sitting in his quarters in the Imperial Palace, 4 months after the clone rebellion he had not known was happening, began to crack the foundation of everything he had built, Anakin Skywalker understood what Palpatine had done. Not through manipulation, but through permission. The Emperor had given him permission to be the thing he was most terrified of becoming, and Anakin had taken it like a drowning man takes air, and in taking it, had become nothing else. The choice ahead of him was simple in the way that very terrible things are simple. He could ignore the message from Cody, ignore the encrypted network of clone commanders asking if he knew, and remain Vader. Or he could open the door that he had been trying to keep closed and face what waited on the other side. There was no third option. There never had been. It begins not with a weapon or an army, but with a voice, a transmission across the holonet, broadcast simultaneously to every corner of the galaxy. And in that moment, the secret that has been spreading quietly through encrypted military channels for 5 months becomes impossible to unsay. On the steps of the Senate chamber on Coruscant, Obi-Wan Kenobi stands with Yoda, and between them lies something that has taken 4 months to gather. Holographic evidence of Palpatine's command to the clone army, records from Kamino's archives, testimony from Commander Cody, and the terrible, irrefutable proof that Order 66 was never law. It was genocide masked as duty. The choice to go public was not made lightly, and there is something you should understand about that. It meant surrendering the one advantage they had ever held, which was invisibility. But invisibility had its own cost. Jedi were still being hunted. Clones were still being hunted. Every day of silence meant another world pledging itself to Palpatine's narrative, another senator too afraid to ask the questions that needed asking. So on this day in month 5, Obi-Wan steps before the Senate, not to demand, but to bear witness, to lay out the architecture of the conspiracy with the precision of a Jedi scholar and the weight of a man who has been running long enough. He speaks of Kamino, of Nala Se's preserved records showing the inhibitor chip's installation in the genetic code itself, of order forms signed in Palpatine's own hand, of a Sith Lord orchestrating genocide from within the very office meant to protect the Republic. Yoda, standing beside him, speaks less. He did not speak much when he was young, and he speaks less now. But what emerges is the testimony of his own confrontation with Palpatine in the Senate chamber, the moment he recognized in the man he had served alongside for decades the presence of a dark side master. The broadcast does not end there. Across the holonet, constrained though it is by Imperial censorship, a second transmission threads through, Mon Mothma's voice, measured and unflinching, addressing the Senate and the galaxy. A formal declaration of the rebellion, invoking the Constitution of the Galactic Republic, citing precedent from the ancient petition of 2000, and calling on every senator, every soldier, every citizen to remember what they were before fear rewrote the story. Bail Organa's name appears on documentation of every Jedi safe house, every defecting clone unit, every resistance cell that has been quietly sheltering the hunted across the Outer Rim. And he does not deny it, standing in the full light of Senate broadcast and daring the Emperor to execute him for it. In the Imperial Palace, Palpatine receives the news as it airs, and for perhaps the first time since the ascension of his empire, something like genuine shock crosses his ancient face. He had expected rebellion. Rebellion is predictable, controllable, manufacturable into proof of the necessity of his order. But he had not expected this. The machinery of the Senate itself being turned against him through the Constitution he had claimed to preserve. The military intelligence that should have been absolutely loyal instead weaponized against him by clone commanders who had chosen free will over obedience. The entire narrative structure he had spent 5 months building now crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence. On every world where there is a holonet relay, the transmissions tear through the propaganda, the order itself, in the Emperor's own voice, commanding genocide, the biochips, detailed in clinical scientific language that stripped away all dignity from the deception. The names of Jedi who had fallen because a chip malfunctioned in some clones but held firm in others, leaving a scattered cross-section of the galaxy's survivors to understand that they lived only because of a technical failure and the choice of men like Cody and Rex and Commander Grey. What follows is not instantaneous collapse. The Empire is not so fragile as that, but rather a fracturing along lines that had been forming in secret for months. Military units, whose commanders had been part of the encrypted network, now openly declare their refusal to receive orders from the Imperial Palace. Admiral Akbar, who had been preparing Mon Cala's fleets in silence, now brings them to open ports of call for any who seek refuge. Generals like Garm Bel Iblis of Corellia, who had privately harbored doubts, now openly position their command structures against Imperial consolidation. The Senate, which had applauded the declaration of empire 5 months prior. And yes, I find myself thinking about that moment often, about how easily fear becomes compliance, how readily people call surrender security, now finds itself divided in a way that cannot be hidden. Core World senators close ranks around Palpatine, understanding that the Empire's promise of safety is now the only thing between them and chaos. But a growing bloc, the founding members of what will, in time, become known as the Rebellion, invokes the dormant constitutional procedures for revoking emergency powers, turning the Senate itself into a battleground of law and procedure, and the question of who has the legitimate right to rule. In the Outer Rim, something stranger and more complicated unfolds. The Separatist survivors, the ones who were never formally stood down because Palpatine's plans fractured before he could finish the massacre that would have ended the conflict, recognize that the appearance of military weakness in the Empire creates an opening they did not expect to have. Former CIS factions, long dormant, begin tentative overtures toward the emerging rebellion, calculating whether an alliance with Jedi and clone defectors offers better odds than subjugation under the Empire. Hutts and independent operators begin repositioning themselves. The political landscape transforms from a binary of Republic versus Empire into something more complex and far less predictable. On 100 worlds, where clone garrisons have received the broadcast, soldiers who had spent 5 months living with the weight of their own potential to resist now understand they were not alone. Some of them will choose the Jedi path. Some will choose independence. Some will return to obedience because that is the only language they were ever taught to speak. But they will choose, and that, the sheer fact of choosing, is something Palpatine can never again take from them. Anakin Skywalker, in the Imperial Palace, watches the broadcast alone, and in the silence afterward, he confronts a truth that has been waiting beneath every order the Emperor has given him. The man who promised to teach him to prevent death is himself being exposed as a liar, an architect of suffering, a Sith Lord who orchestrated everything, including Anakin's own fall, for nothing but the consolidation of power. There is a moment in every life where the door that has been held closed finally rattles on its hinges, and you must decide whether to turn the lock or to let it open. For Anakin, that moment is arriving. On Coruscant and across the galaxy, in encrypted military channels and Senate galleries, and the hidden sanctuaries where Jedi have been quietly sheltering, the understanding settles like rain. The secret is no longer a secret, and whatever comes next must be fought in the open. There is no going back. There is only forward, into uncertainty, into the terrible weight of free will made manifest. The Emperor stands alone in his office above the Sith shrine, watching the holonet feeds that should have broken his enemies, instead multiplying them. And for the first time in his careful designs, Palpatine allows himself to feel the thin edge of something he would never name as fear. The broadcast had been minutes. Obi-Wan's scarred face speaking directly to the Senate, to the military, to the galaxy itself. Yoda's quiet gravity lending weight to proof of the inhibitor chips, the conspiracy, the genocide that Order 66 had meant to be. And the worst part, the part that gnaws at him in the dark hours when his reflection in the transparisteel shows him the lightning-scarred face Mace Windu gave him, is that he knows the image is partly right. He had engineered order through control, had weaponized biology itself to ensure obedience, and that truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. But Palpatine has not survived this long by accepting loss as final, and so in the days after the broadcast, his machinery shifts, not dismantling, but transforming, like the slow turning of a vast ship toward a different horizon. The first wave comes from the Inquisitorius, Grand Inquisitor, a pawn figure whose pale skin and sunken eyes carry the weight of a fallen Jedi temple guard, arrives at the Imperial Palace with preliminary reports on 43 Force-sensitive targets across the Outer Rim, and behind him come others. The second sister, Trilla Sujuri, whose dark eyes hold the particular bitterness of a broken Padawan. The fifth brother, the seventh sister, a growing roster of hunters who were once hunted, who understand the prey's instincts because they lived them. These are not the obedient clone battalions that failed him. These are beings who chose the dark side, who were broken and remade, and who will not hesitate because hesitation itself has been excised from them by years of training in pain and compliance. Palpatine watches, the Inquisitor reports with something approaching satisfaction, understanding that fear of the hunter is more reliable than programming ever was. The second move unfolds in the Senate building itself. Mas Amedda, his Grand Vizier, orchestrates a counter-narrative so carefully threaded that even Palpatine finds himself admiring its architecture. The Jedi conspiracy is reframed not as a lie, but as a security failure, a tragedy born of the Jedi's own hidden ambitions. The clone defections become isolated corruption, a few bad soldiers rather than a systemic collapse. The inhibitor chips themselves are reimagined as safeguards against Jedi manipulation, proof of the Emperor's foresight rather than proof of his betrayal. On the HoloNet, the story becomes an Emperor who loved the clones enough to protect them against a Jedi Order that would have used them as tools forever. The propaganda is so carefully balanced that senators who had begun to believe otherwise find themselves questioning their own instincts, which is precisely the point. And then comes the third move, the one that transforms the Empire from a weakened dictatorship into something far more dangerous. Tarkin arrives on Coruscant with a proposal written in the language of doctrine and philosophy, the Tarkin Doctrine, which Palpatine reads with genuine appreciation. Rule through fear of overwhelming force rather than force itself, Tarkin argues, and Palpatine understands immediately that this is how they will survive the loss of clone obedience. Not by relying on anyone's compliance, but by making every being in the galaxy understand that resistance itself is futile, that the threat of imperial power is so absolute that even considering defiance becomes irrational. The beauty of it is that it requires no trust, no programming, no hope in subordinates, only the construction of such terrible capacity for destruction that hope itself dies. The Death Star project, years from completion but already being accelerated, becomes the physical embodiment of this doctrine, a weapon so large, so absolute, that its mere existence becomes a form of governance. Within weeks, Director Krennic is given expanded resources and a direct pipeline to the Emperor's attention. Worlds are selected to demonstrate what happens to those who harbor doubts. Lothal burns under Imperial strip mining, its resources consumed, and its people conscripted into labor camps, a demonstration of what the Tarkin Doctrine looks like in practice. The planet becomes a gallery of control, stripped of resistance by the simple mathematics of overwhelming disparity. Meanwhile, the COMPNOR machine accelerates. HoloNet news broadcasts become more coordinated, more seamless in their messaging. The sub-adult group targets worlds where young people can be turned into true believers before memory or doubt can take root. The Imperial Security Bureau deepens its networks, turning informants into a currency of power more reliable than credits. The ISB director begins compiling lists. Senators who voted wrong, military officers whose loyalty is suspect, planetary governors who might harbor sympathies with the rebellion that Mon Mothma and Bail Organa are now openly organizing. And Palpatine watches it all unfold with the satisfaction of a master composer, hearing his symphony finally reach its crescendo. But there is something else, too, something that moves beneath the surface like a current too deep for most to perceive. He thinks of Exegol, of the work being done in the unknown regions, of the Sith eternal cultists who serve not the Empire but the dark side itself, who are preparing mechanisms that extend far beyond this moment. The Empire is a tool, a magnificent tool, yes, but ultimately a tool, and it will serve its purpose or it will be cast aside. The rule of 2,000 years of Sith ambition is not about who sits on the throne, but about which power survives. And Palpatine has already ensured that even if this empire should fall, the dark side will endure. The inhibitor chips were never the real contingency. They were merely the obvious one, and the Jedi were always going to exploit the obvious if given the chance. What matters is that in losing the chips, in transforming his strategy to rely instead on fear and propaganda and the grinding machinery of the COMPNOR, on the Inquisitors who will hunt the last Jedi into the dark, on weapons so absolute that resistance becomes philosophy rather than action, Palpatine has created something far more durable than programmed obedience. He has created the Empire as ideology, as faith, as the inevitable shape of the galaxy. And the hunted Jedi, the defecting clones, the senators who still believe in democracy, they are no longer his opponents, really. They are the bacteria trying to convince a star that it should be smaller, dimmer, less absolute in its burning. 3 months into the Empire's reign, with Order 66 shattered and his neat machinery of genocide failed, the Emperor is weakened in some ways, but paradoxically more dangerous in others. The hunters are loose in the galaxy, searching. The message of inevitable Imperial power broadcasts on every frequency. The infrastructure of fear is being woven into the very fabric of how people breathe and think and dream. And on the unknown regions, the real work continues, patient and vast, the way dark side sorcery always works. Decades in advance, centuries in vision, building toward a future where even if the Emperor falls today, the darkness will rise again tomorrow. This is what it means when fear becomes doctrine, when ideology becomes governance, when the threat itself becomes more powerful than any blow could ever be. In the 6th month after the chips began to fail across the galaxy, the shape of the resistance shifted from hiding into something that looked, for the first time, like a command structure. Commander Cody stood in a borrowed briefing room on a Mon Calamari cruiser, orange pauldron catching the light, looking at tactical displays that showed 17 simultaneous theaters of conflict, and he understood that someone had to think through all of them. Around him were the other commanders, Wolf with his scarred face and his confidence in adaptive tactics, Gregor with his quiet pragmatism, Bly, whose hands had executed his Jedi general and who carried that knowledge into every decision, Rex, technically a captain but functioning as something closer to the conscience of the whole network. These men had been engineered on Camino by the Kaminoans, flash-trained in the academies, taught to execute commands without question, and then given the impossible gift of their own refusal. Now they had to learn something the Republic's Jedi generals had known how to do. They had to unify strategy across worlds that were light years apart, coordinate thousands of troops through channels that Palpatine could still monitor, and do it all while carrying the weight of orders they had never wanted to give. Cody had always been the kind of commander who understood that the mission lived or died on clarity of communication and discipline in execution. That had made him invaluable to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it made him invaluable now to something much larger and more fragile. What he did not have, what the Jedi generals had given to him, was the battle meditation, that force-touched clarity of mind that allowed Mace Windu or Yoda to see the shape of the entire conflict and sense what would break and what would hold. That gift was gone, burned away with the temple. But Rex had something else. He had been close enough to Anakin Skywalker to understand the kind of aggressive, adaptive thinking that could respond to an enemy that was itself adaptive. And Cody recognized that in the coming campaigns, that kind of improvisation would matter as much as precision. The 212th Attack Battalion was in the Outer Rim, pushing into sectors that had been separatist-held for 3 years. The 41st Elite Corps was moving through jungle terrain on Felucia, where the separatist occupation was brutal and entrenched. The Galactic Marines under Bakara's guidance were holding ground on Maijito against banking clan defenses that were sophisticated and unyielding. Each commander reported through encrypted channels that cycled every 8 hours, and each was dealing with variations of the same problem. They had clones who were learning to follow orders from free choice rather than from compulsion, Jedi survivors who had lost their institutional certainty, and enemies who did not yet understand that the Republic's military apparatus had been fractured from within. I think about that moment often, the way Cody looked at those displays, and the certainty that crossed his face, not that they would win, but that the shape of leadership itself had changed. A clone commander before Order 66 had executed his general's strategy. He passed down orders and expected compliance, because compliance was neurologically wired in. A clone commander now had to think like a Jedi general without the Force, to hold the whole pattern in his mind and know that every decision rippled through soldiers who could now refuse and who might be right to do so. The 212th had always been known for discipline, for the kind of professional execution that made them preferred partners for someone like Obi-Wan, who valued precision over brutality. Cody had learned that discipline was not the same as obedience to an immoral order. It was the clarity to refuse, and then to live with what refusal cost. When Palpatine's latest directives came through Imperial channels, ordering mass civilian pacification operations and the destruction of water processing facilities on worlds under clone protection, Cody did not hesitate. He encrypted the refusal in a way that would take Imperial cipher teams hours to parse, and by that time, his forces had already moved on. That kind of resistance was not dramatic. There were no climactic battles in the 6th month, no grand reversals. Instead, there was the slow grinding work of moving 30,000 clone troopers across 3 star systems, while ensuring that ATTE walkers arrived where they needed to be, that LAAT gunships were fueled and crewed, that medics had Bacta, and that clone commandos knew which objectives were actually worth dying for. The partnership that emerged between Cody and Obi-Wan transformed into something different but recognizable. The general could no longer direct Cody's movements through force-touched intuition, but Cody had learned to think strategically, to hold multiple objectives in mind, to weigh cost against outcome. Rex began developing doctrine for combined arms operations that did not rely on Jedi battle meditation. Instead, they used networked communication, redundant command structures, and the kind of aggressive reconnaissance that had always been his strength. Wolf, who had commanded in dense jungle terrain under Plo Koon, understood how to break separatist defenses that relied on numerical superiority. He was willing to take losses if it meant disrupting the enemy's next 10 moves. Bly carried his guilt into every operation, the weight of hands that had executed a Jedi general he respected, and that weight made him careful, methodical, unwilling to spend lives cheaply even when the mathematics of war might justify it. These commanders began to understand something that took the Jedi 1,000 years to learn. That leadership was not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions in a room with people you trusted enough to tell you the truth. The Outer Rim sieges that followed, the push into Maijito, the consolidation of Felucia, the careful liberation of Salukami, were commanded not by a single Jedi general with the Force at his fingertips, but by a network of clone commanders learning to lead without the crutch of compulsion or prophecy. On the capital ships above those worlds, clone naval officers like those who had served under Yularen began coordinating with Jedi survivors to track Imperial movements. On the ground, clone commandos operated in 4-man deep strike teams to gather intelligence that the main forces needed to survive. The 501st Legion, which had been Anakin Skywalker's personal command, began to splinter. Some troopers followed those still loyal to the idea of Vader, but others, quietly and without fanfare, began to listen to Rex's encrypted messages about free will and the terrible clarity of understanding yourself as something more than a tool. It was in month 7 that Cody received a message from Commander Fox on Coruscant, encrypted through 7 relay stations. The Coruscant Guard was experiencing what Fox called unprecedented disciplinary challenges, which translated to mean that an entire planetary security force was quietly preparing to defend the capital against the very regime it had been engineered to serve. I find myself thinking about what that must have felt like, to be a clone trooper, trained from accelerated childhood to serve, only to discover that the Republic you were bred to protect had been murdered, and the only way to honor your oath was to refuse the very structure that defined you. That is the heart of the clone commander story in month 6 and 7. Not glory, but the unbearable weight of learning to think for themselves, and discovering that thinking clearly about what is right is harder than simply obeying someone else's answer. The resistance at that point was not yet strong enough to challenge the Empire openly. It was still scattered, still encrypted, still fragmentary. But it was no longer invisible, and that was everything. In every theater, clone commanders were learning to lead without the Force, without biochips, without the comfort of having someone else decide what honor meant. And slowly, with careful moves and heavy casualties and moments of genuine doubt, they began to hold their ground, not because they were invincible, but because they had chosen to be there, and that choice made all the difference. There is a moment, a single moment, when Anakin Skywalker sits alone in the dark of his chamber deep within the Imperial Palace, and he allows himself to wonder if the man he calls Master has ever told him the truth about anything at all. The encrypted message from Commander Cody arrives on a military channel marked dead for weeks, carrying with it a weight of revelation that Anakin cannot unknow. Order 66 failed because of biochips in clone brains, engineered into them as they grew in their tanks on Kamino, designed by Palpatine to turn them into executioners without choice. He reads Cody's testimony, measured, technical, damning, describing the moment the 212th Attack Battalion's biochip misfired on Utapau, the split second when a soldier found himself capable of refusal, and in that capacity discovered something about being human that no one had bothered to tell him he was allowed to want. Across the network, other voices follow. Commander Wolf from the 104th, Captain Rex, who had known something was wrong and had lived in hiding for weeks with the knowledge. Even Crosshair's silence speaks volumes to those who listen closely enough to understand that silence itself can be a form of testimony. And Anakin, reading, begins to understand the shape of the architecture that has contained him since he was 9 years old on a desert world, watching a diplomat teach him about the power to prevent death. Palpatine had found him when he was a child, a gift, he'd called it, to have a promising young pilot at a banquet, and Anakin had felt seen for the first time in his life by someone who did not doubt him, did not caution him about fear or attachment or hubris. For 13 years, this man had been the only voice that never wavered, the only presence that offered certainty when the Jedi Council traded in careful qualifications and measured warnings. And Anakin had given him everything he had because gratitude had taught him that this was what love looked like. But the message from Cody contained something else. Proof that the entire clone war itself had been orchestrated, that the separatist crisis was manufactured, that Palpatine had engineered both sides of a conflict designed to last exactly long enough to reshape the Republic into something else entirely. Anakin's 501st Legion, Vader's Fist, they called it, the unit that had followed him into the temple, that had cut down the younglings in the archives, that had made of him an instrument of genocide. Those soldiers were not monsters who had finally revealed their true nature. They were slaves who had been programmed to become monsters, and the programming had broken, and they had chosen to be human instead. He sits with this knowledge the way one sits with a poison working through the body. Slowly, then all at once, the numbness giving way to sensation. Padme had tried to tell him something about conscience, about the difference between obedience and righteousness, in those final hours before he strangled her, or before the Emperor told him he had strangled her, a memory that had always felt slightly wrong, the way a story feels wrong when it is missing a crucial detail. The Emperor had said his anger had killed her. The Emperor had said he was powerful enough to reshape life and death itself, and Anakin had believed him because believing had been easier than the alternative. But a clone commander in hiding, a man without choice who had learned to choose, had sent a message across encrypted channels, and in that message was the simple, devastating fact that the Emperor lies. Vader's suit screams around him, the respirator keeping him alive a constant reminder of his dependence, and Anakin understands now what he should have understood on Mustafar, that the armor is not a rescue but a cage, that every breath is purchased with fealty, that Palpatine keeps him alive the way one keeps an engine running, functional, useful, and ultimately disposable. He thinks about the Chosen One, a prophecy the Council had spoken of with hope and dread in equal measure, and he wonders if balance meant something different than he had understood, if there was a version of this story where the Chosen One did not bring order through submission, but through refusal. The clone soldiers had refused, and the sky had not fallen. Instead, the machinery had broken, and choice had spread through the ranks like an infection, and suddenly Jedi were alive who should have been dead, and senators were speaking in chambers again, and the Emperor's certainty had begun to look fragile for the first time. Anakin begins to move, removing the datapad, beginning the careful work of translating what he knows into something that can be weaponized against the only master he has ever served. He knows the location of the Sith shrine beneath the Senate building, the dark energy nexus where Palpatine had cultivated his power for decades in shadow. He knows the Inquisitor's safe houses, the names of agents turned to the dark side, the protocols for Imperial intelligence that Palpatine had entrusted to him, because Palpatine had believed him broken enough to never think of turning that knowledge outward. He knows Palpatine's own combat patterns, the ways the Emperor moves with the Force, the places where even his power reaches thin. And he knows something else, something that comes to him as he stands in the darkness of his chamber, that the lie about Padmé was the final thing keeping him locked in this prison. Because if Padmé is alive somewhere, if there is any possibility that Palpatine lied about that as readily as he lied about everything else, then Anakin has a reason to move toward something other than Palpatine's commands. He does not yet let himself hope. The habit of despair is too deep in his bones for that. But he begins to prepare, to move quietly through encrypted channels toward the network of defecting clones and hunted Jedi, offering not his loyalty, but something more dangerous, his knowledge. The man who became Darth Vader is beginning, in the isolation of his chamber, to remember that he was once Anakin Skywalker, and that memory is a blade sharp enough to wound the very man who made him into armor and breath. It is not redemption yet. Redemption is still months away, still requires a confrontation with the Emperor himself, still demands sacrifice that Anakin Skywalker does not yet understand he will be asked to make. But it is the first choice, the one that matters because it cannot be undone. The moment when a broken man decides that his master's lies have become intolerable and that even the smallest act of defiance is better than the continuation of servitude. And I find myself thinking about this a lot. That redemption does not arrive as a sudden illumination, but as a series of small choices to believe in something other than the voice that has kept you alive, to risk the unknown rather than accept the known chains. There is something profound in that, I think. The idea that even someone as far fallen as Anakin Skywalker could find within himself the capacity to turn, to stand against the darkness that had shaped him, because he had seen that the people around him had chosen differently, and in their choosing, they had shown him it was possible. At the end of the 9th month, the assault on Imperial Center began not with a trumpet call, but with encrypted authorization codes, shared quietly between clone commanders and Jedi in the darkness. The plan was decades old in conception and weeks old in execution. A convergence of Jedi starfighters descending through Coruscant's upper atmosphere, clone trooper transports emerging from hyperspace in coordinated squadrons, and Mon Mothma's diplomatic blockade transforming into a military cordon with Admiral Akbar's Mon Calamari cruisers holding the orbital approaches. For the first time since the Republic's founding, the planet itself became a battlefield, not by conquest, but by reclamation, and the symbolism of that distinction mattered more than anyone could quite articulate. Obi-Wan Kenobi, flying an Eta 2 Actis interceptor with R4 navigating the approach vectors, felt the weight of Coruscant beneath him. 3 trillion souls living in the hive spires and undercity tunnels, most of them unaware that the calculus of their freedom was being decided by the starfighters cutting through the atmosphere above them. He had fought in the separatist wars across 1,000 worlds, but Coruscant was home, and returning to it as an invader rather than a protector unsettled something in him that he had carefully kept locked away since Order 66. Commander Cody was already on the ground, having moved his 212th Attack Battalion into position 3 days prior, ostensibly to suppress unidentified paramilitary activity in the Senate District. A report filed through legitimate Imperial channels and never questioned, because the report came from the right authorization code, and no one had yet learned to distrust clone officers the way the Emperor had tried to teach them to. The assault on the Imperial Palace, the Jedi Temple, renamed and repurposed, still humming with the dark side energies that Palpatine had nurtured in its foundations, began with a breach of the outer shield generators, accomplished by teams of clone engineers working alongside Jedi who could feel the dark side's pressure like a weight against their ribs. Palpatine learned of the invasion not from reconnaissance, but from the sudden, screaming absence of 1,000 contingent futures that he had been holding in his precognition. He was in the Senate chamber when it happened, which was fitting, because the Senate chamber was where he had always meant to make his final stand. That vast rotunda with its floating pods, and the great circular floor where the voice of the galaxy had once gathered, now empty except for his royal guard and the bureaucratic apparatus of Mars Amda and the ruling council. The Supreme Chancellor had become the Emperor, but the Emperor had always known that the seat of true power on Coruscant was not the palace but the gavel, and Palpatine had preserved the Senate chamber not from sentiment, but from understanding that symbols move people more certainly than plasma bolts. When Yoda arrived in that chamber, not attacking but advancing with deliberate grace, his gimmer stick held before him like a question, Palpatine was waiting, and the duel that followed was not the same confrontation as had occurred years before, when Yoda had come alone. This time Obi-Wan was approaching from the lower temple levels, cutting through the Sith shrine itself with Anakin Skywalker at his side, the chosen one whose presence in the Force blazed like a sun that had finally remembered how to burn rightward. This time, the 501st Legion was not storming the temple, but defending it, Commander Rex moving his troops through the lower spires with the methodical precision of a man who had lived in this structure's blueprints and now reclaimed them. The dark side did not loosen its grip easily. The oppressive weight of the Sith shrine beneath the temple, the accumulated years of Palpatine's malevolence soaked into the stone and the Force itself, resisted them like a tide. But dark side nexuses had a weakness that Palpatine had never fully understood, perhaps because he had been too close to it for too long. They could be overwritten, not through force, but through intention, through the accumulated will of people who had chosen to be present rather than controlled, whose choices were their own. When Anakin Skywalker walked into that chamber, the light side of the Force walking beside him so visibly that even non-Force sensitives could see it, something in the architecture of Palpatine's reality fractured. The Emperor's lightning came instantly, wide and terrible, the kind of Force lightning that could strip flesh from bone and leave only ash. But Anakin was no longer the conflicted boy who had come to this palace in desperation, and his lightsaber caught the bolts not through technique, but through the simple fact that his will had aligned itself with something true. Palpatine fought for hours, not in continuous combat, but in phases, dual retreat, psychic assault, counter-offensive, because he was not fighting just Yoda and Obi-Wan, but the entire weight of the Jedi Order reassembling itself in real time around him, and also fighting the fact that his own instrument of power, the clone army, had chosen to defect en masse. The Coruscant Guard, standing in the Senate chamber under Commander Fox's leadership, lowered their weapons rather than draw them when the Jedi emerged. The Emperor's royal guard fought to the last, because they had been raised since infancy to see Palpatine as the center of all meaning, but they were the last, and they were just people, and they fell like people fell. In the end, it was Anakin who struck the final blow, not as revenge, not as redemption, but as a simple act of will, the chosen one finally making a choice that was entirely his own, and in that act bringing a kind of balance to the Force that the prophecy had whispered about for 1,000 years. Palpatine's death released a wave of Force energy that knocked everyone back, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, no more, there was a feeling in the chamber of something vast and pleased, as if the living Force itself had taken a breath. I think of it now as a kind of waking, as if a blindness that had covered the entire galaxy lifted simultaneously, and every Force-sensitive being, every Jedi in hiding, and every clone who had learned to choose, felt something settle into place. The immediate aftermath was not euphoria, but exhaustion, and a kind of profound uncertainty. The ruling council surrendered within hours. Mars Amda was arrested in his office. The Imperial Navy in orbit stood down when confronted with the news of the Emperor's death, and the fact that their clone commanding officers had already decided loyalty to the Republic superseded loyalty to the throne. Mon Mothma reconvened the Senate in an emergency session, and the vote to formally dissolve the Empire and restore the Galactic Republic, to reactivate the Constitution and annul all emergency decrees issued since Palpatine's rise to Chancellor, passed with only a handful of abstentions. It was broadcast on the HoloNet to every world in the galaxy, and it took time to sink in because hope deferred so long does not come back easily. The war was not over. There remained separatist remnants to negotiate with, Imperial governors in the Outer Rim to remove, worlds that had tasted Imperial order and would not let it go without resistance. But the architecture of absolute darkness that had seemed immovable had, in the space of a single day, become dust. And in the lower levels of Coruscant, in the refugee shelters and the Undercity, 3 trillion people went to sleep that night not knowing quite what had changed, but feeling it nonetheless, like a weight that had pressed down on them since before they were born suddenly lifting. There is something I find myself returning to when I think about that day, about how a conspiracy built on the premise that people are merely instruments, that will can be programmed, and choice can be engineered away, was defeated by a series of people who decided, in the smallest possible moments, that they were more than their design. Tonight, I want to tell you about the months that came after, when the Empire fell and the galaxy, breathing in the strange, new air of possibility, had to decide what it would become. The dust of Coruscant's burning still hung in the upper atmosphere when Mon Mothma stood in the Senate chamber and called the Republic back to life. It was not a triumphant return to something that had been. It was a tentative knocking on the door of something that might have been, had people chosen differently a decade before. In the weeks following Palpatine's death in that same chamber, brought down not by a Jedi, but by a fallen Jedi choosing, finally, to refuse, the basic work of reconstruction began. First, there was the matter of law. The emergency powers that had accreted around the throne like barnacles for years had to be explicitly revoked, written out of the new constitution in language that could not be ambiguous again. The petition of 2000, that quiet statement of conscience that senators had signed years before in opposition to endless war, became the skeleton of the new framework. What had cost those senators so much to propose now seemed obvious, the obvious wisdom of people who had watched their republic corrode from within. But obvious in hindsight is a comfort that tastes, I think, like ash to those who lived it in real time. The military question came next, and it was thornier than anyone had anticipated. You see, the Galactic Republic that was being restored was not the same republic that had fallen. It could not be, because the instruments of its defense had changed. The clone army, those soldiers engineered to obey, then fractured by the revelation that obedience itself had been a lie, could not simply remain as they were, servants to a new master instead of the old. Across the Mon Calamari academies and in the halls of Chandrila, a new question was posed. What do you do with an army that was never meant to be people, but learned through refusal that they were? The answer, when it came, was both obvious and revolutionary. The kind of answer that makes you wonder why it had to take a genocide nearly succeeding for anyone to ask it. Clone troopers were declared persons under the law. It sounds simple when I say it like that, and I think that simplicity is perhaps the deepest thing about it. Not citizens automatically, though many would pursue that path. Persons, which meant they held rights, could own property, could choose their own path forward, could refuse. The irony, and I do not say this lightly, is that they had to prove they were human by refusing an order that would have made them the perfect soldiers. Their personhood was born in the moment they disobeyed. The Kaminoans, those long-necked cloners of Kamino who had engineered the chips and accelerated the growth cycles that halved a clone's natural lifespan, were tried for crimes against sentience. Nala C, who had carried the data of the inhibitor chip program, and made the choice to preserve records of what Palpatine had done, gave testimony that many said saved her life. She had preserved the truth when it cost her everything, and that preservation became the cornerstone of the reparations framework. A trust was established, the Camino Restitution Fund, that would pay reparations to every clone trooper who survived, compensation for the lost years of accelerated aging, for the violation of neural autonomy, for the brothers and sisters who had committed genocide under the direction of a programming they never consented to. It would take centuries to truly reckon with what had been done, and I think everyone involved understood that the payments and the apologies and the legal language were all, in some sense, insufficient. How do you quantify the cost of theft of choice itself? But the attempt itself was something, and that attempt shaped the New Republic in ways both seen and invisible. Then came the restoration of the Jedi Order, and this, perhaps, required even more careful thinking. The order that returned was not the order that had fallen, not in structure, not in certainty, not in the way it understood its own place in the galaxy. Yoda, who had guided the Jedi for nearly 900 years, stepped back from direct leadership, a choice that surprised many who did not understand that Grand Master was a title he had grown weary of bearing long before the chips activated. Obi-Wan Kenobi, who had wandered the desert of Tatooine and nearly forgotten his own name, returned to the temple to help rebuild it, not as its head, but as a keeper of memory, which was perhaps the role he had needed all along. The new council was reconstituted with survivors, Yoda in an advisory role, Obi-Wan, Quinlan Vos, who had walked a darker path and carried that darkness forward with hard-won wisdom, Cal Kestis, younger and raw with the weight of what he had witnessed, and others whose names have faded from the record but whose presence was felt in those early days. There was a new kind of humility in the Order, born from the recognition that they had been nearly destroyed not because they were weak, but because they had been trusted by a republic they had failed to truly see. The Jedi had been servants of the Republic, defenders of peace, and in that service they had become comfortable, blind to the slow corruption that had wound itself around everything. That blindness had nearly destroyed them. The restored Jedi Order, therefore, would be different, more transparent about its limitations, more willing to question authority, more rooted in the teaching of choice itself. The younglings who began training in the rebuilt temple were taught not just lightsaber forms and force meditation, but the history of what had happened, the full weight of what their order had nearly become, and the terrible importance of staying awake to the possibility of corruption. In the Outer Rim, the work was quieter and more diffuse. Cody, Rex, and other clone commanders who had chosen resistance found themselves in a strange new role. They were neither soldiers nor citizens yet in the full sense, but they were organizers, teachers, witnesses to what had been possible when programming was broken. They worked with Bail Organa and Mon Mothma's early efforts to restore civilian governance to worlds that had suffered under Imperial rule. They testified over and over again about the biochips, about the moment of choice, about what it had meant to suddenly be capable of refusing, and what it had cost to actually do it. Their voices became part of the foundational myth of the restored Republic, not a return to something lost, but a construction of something new, built on the understanding that freedom had to be chosen moment by moment, or it would be taken away. And Anakin Skywalker, but that is a longer story, and perhaps it belongs to the next part of this telling. For now, I will say only that in those months of rebuilding, he was not yet at peace, and perhaps he never would be. But he had made his choice, and it was possible to live in the aftermath of it, which was more than he had thought he would ever have. The galaxy was broken and being remade, and in that remaking there was neither triumph nor despair, but something more honest. The difficult, daily work of choosing to be better than you were yesterday, and then doing it again tomorrow. A year has passed since the moment on Utapau when Commander Cody's hand trembled over the trigger, since the fraction of a second when refusal became possible, And I find myself thinking about what choice actually means when you have just learned it is yours to make. The war is over, though not in the way anyone expected, and the Empire still stands. But its hands are no longer quite so steady on the throat of the galaxy. In the restored Senate on Coruscant, Mon Mothma and Bail Organa pass the legislation that will formally recognize clone troopers as citizens and persons under law. And you can see in the holocordings the moment some of the clone commanders understand they have legal names now, identities that existed before their regiments. Cody sits in the observation gallery and watches the vote pass, and I think there is something in his face. Not relief exactly, but the slow realization that the person he chose to become on Utapau, the man who refused, is now legally permitted to exist. The Kaminoans who designed them are being tried in the courts of the restored Republic, their defense resting on the hollow argument that they were simply following orders from above, which is a tragedy in its own way. The architects of slavery claiming slavery as their excuse. Nala C, testifying, chooses instead to name what she did. She designed people for obedience, she understood what she was building, and she regrets it, which is not redemption, but it is at least the truth, stated plainly and without flinching. Meanwhile, across the Outer Rim, Obi-Wan Kenobi and the surviving Jedi Masters are rebuilding their order in a way that looks nothing like what came before. Where the old Jedi Temple once stood as a fortress of certainty, the new gatherings happen quietly, in borrowed spaces, with a humility that was earned in hiding and loss. Yoda speaks less now. His voice, when he speaks, carries the weight of having buried nearly an entire order. But what he says is this: the Force did not abandon us, and we did not abandon ourselves, and in the clone army's refusal, we saw the Force's will reflected. There is something almost tender in the way he speaks of them now, the soldiers he once commanded in battle. In Ryloth, Cham Syndulla's people shelter clone deserters who chose exile over service to the Empire, and in those settlements, you find something that did not exist before. Clone soldiers learning what it means to have a life that is not defined by obedience. Some of them plant gardens. I know this sounds small, but it is not. And the act of putting a seed in soil and trusting time to make it grow is, for someone engineered for immediate combat utility, almost a form of prayer. Captain Rex moves between these hidden places, carrying messages, bearing witness, and he is a different person now from the soldier who transmitted that first encrypted warning across the clone networks. He has grey at his temples, early grey, born of stress and impossible choices, and he moves with the careful deliberation of someone who understands that every action now belongs to him and only him. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, Anakin Skywalker sits alone, and his isolation is of a kind that few beings in the galaxy will ever know. He has chosen to live, which was itself a choice born not from redemption, but from the realization that those he was designed to break had learned to refuse, and that refusal had exposed the lie at the center of his own existence. Some days he is paralyzed by the weight of what his hands have done. Other days he rises and tries, in small ways, to move toward something like repair. The Jedi do not forgive him. Forgiveness is perhaps beyond even them. But they have decided that a living reminder of how close the galaxy came to absolute darkness is more valuable than his death. And Anakin lives in the space between that decision and his own desert-born capacity to hope. He works in the Temple's archives now, helping restore the records that Order 66 tried to burn, and there is in this work something like atonement, though he does not permit himself to call it that. Across the galaxy, in the schools and marketplaces where the HoloNet now broadcasts competing narratives instead of Imperial doctrine, people are learning that the clone army refused, that ordinary soldiers made a choice that echoed across 1,000 star systems. That story, the quiet choice, the hesitation that became refusal, has become a seed of something new, a living proof that obedience is not inevitable, that even those engineered for servitude can choose otherwise. It is not a triumphant story, because too many died and too much was broken. But it is a story about what becomes possible when someone says no, and the person beside them, listening, decides to say no as well. In the oldest part of the Jedi Temple, in a room that once held thousands of meditation spheres, Yoda walks with a young clone, a deserter named Gregor, who lost everything to the Empire and found something else entirely. And the Grand Master points to the Force-sensitive flowers that are growing wild in the neglected garden. They grow in patterns that follow no design, answering to no command, and Yoda speaks about choice and the Force, about how the ability to choose is itself a form of the Force's own freedom, pressing outward against every system designed to deny it. Gregor listens, and for a moment, just a moment, he feels something settle inside him that has been moving and afraid since the day his inhibitor chip malfunctioned, and he understood for the first time that he belonged to himself. What strikes me now about this year that has passed since Cody's hesitation on Utapau is how little and how much has changed. The Empire still exists, Palpatine is dead, but the machinery of his doctrine continues, and there are still stormtroopers in white armor moving through streets that used to belong to a republic that was never quite what it promised to be. But in the encrypted networks where clones still pass messages to one another, in the hidden temples where Jedi are learning to teach again, in the Senate chambers where voices now argue and disagree openly instead of obey in silence, something genuinely new is being built. It is not built on certainty or clear victory, but on the stubborn, patient insistence that the future belongs to those who choose it, not those who are chosen for it. And perhaps that is all legacy ever is. The choices we make, small and ordinary, in the face of a world that tells us we have no choice to make. The Jedi learned this from the clones, finally, after nearly 1,000 years of believing that acceptance and surrender to the Force's will was the highest virtue. But the Force's will, it turned out, includes the right